Oh, g'day, mate. 40 here. So let's talk about the election 2020. And think about the price of crying wolf for decades. Republicans have cried wolf for decades, saying that the United States has a major voting fraud problem, but they never provided substantive evidence. In fact, when their cases actually had to go to court on this, they couldn't produce. They couldn't make their case. Their case was always vague and general. I started reading John Fund's book on electoral fraud. He's published 2 books on voter fraud. And on the first page, he talks about how 8 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were registered to vote. I know that's false. So when I read such an obvious falsehood at the beginning of a book, it just destroys my enthusiasm for reading the book. I just don't think he's particularly credible. And when John Fund has been called on this, he said, I got that from an anonymous source. Well, what a lousy reporter are you that you would just rely on an anonymous source for an allegation like that? There are other ways to get at that information. It's clearly false. He proclaimed it on various TV news shows. He leads off his book on voter fraud with this allegation, and there's just no substance behind it. So Republicans aren't doing a very good job trying to make their case that there's voter fraud. Now, election 2020, we have Republicans crying once again that there's been massive voter fraud that cost Donald Trump the election. That may well be true, but they've done such a poor job until now that nobody outside of true believers is taking them seriously, even though they may have a good case this time around. But because for decades they cried voter fraud and failed to produce the evidence, nobody takes them seriously. Donald Trump in 2016 kept talking about this as a rigged election, but he provided no evidence. And so Donald Trump has made so many fact-free allegations of this kind that people don't take him seriously this time around unless they're already true believers. 2017, the New Yorker produced this podcast on 3 views of voter fraud.
I'm Dorothy Wickenden. On today's Politics and More podcast, 3 perspectives on voter fraud. First, the story of one of the very few voter fraud cases that are actually prosecuted in this country. Then David Remnick talks with the columnist John Fund, who believes that voter fraud is widespread and hard to detect. But political science professor Lorraine Maniti tells staff writer Jelani Cobb that purposeful fraud in our electoral system essentially does not exist.
For generations, the truth of American democracy has been that we seem not to like it very much. We don't act on it.
Right. So think about voting. Voting is not a particularly rational act because how often does your one vote decide an election? So to think that people would risk a felony, that people would risk going to prison, to think that people would risk these enormous downsides to cast one vote just does not rationally make sense. So I think there's no way that individuals voted deliberately, fraudulently in 2020 in a significant way. So if there is a voter fraud case to be made, it's not the case that individuals are taking advantage of a system that's easy to take advantage of. Now, the system may be easy to take advantage of, but the enormous downside for individuals to commit voter fraud versus the very tiny upside that their one vote might make a difference makes it hard for me to take that angle of voter fraud seriously.
Ask your fellow Americans to get out and vote, and it's a very tough sell, even in a presidential election where we vote at much lower rates than most Western democracies. Voter turnout in a country that prides itself as being one of the first democracies in the world is embarrassing, and has been so for a long time. This isn't some new form of modern American cynicism. But in recent years, some in the political world have diagnosed a new problem. Too many people voting. Or maybe better put, the wrong kind of people.
The White House is standing by President Donald Trump's unsubstantiated claim that millions of people voted illegally in the November election.
Donald Trump is not the first person to claim that voter fraud is a serious problem. Chris Kobach, who now serves as vice chair of Trump's advisory commission.
Okay, so in 2016, saying that millions of people voted illegally, and that's the only reason that Donald Trump did not win the popular vote, that was emotionally appealing. But think about the consequences of that. Now you may very well have voter fraud, but you have so destroyed your credibility that nobody outside of true believers is taking you seriously. So there's a price to be paid for Republicans and for the president claiming in 2016 that millions of people voted illegally without producing the evidence, right? You can't keep making allegations without evidence and expect neutral parties, let alone critical and hostile parties. There may very well be significant voter fraud this time around, but nobody is taking the Republicans' case seriously outside of Republican true believers, precisely because of this long allegations of voter fraud without presenting the evidence to support the allegations.
On election integrity, claimed in 2010 that in his home state of Kansas, as many as 2,000 people cast ballots using the names of dead.
And remember, Chris Kobach is a favorite of American nationalists, of populists, of people who want to reduce immigration. And I want to reduce immigration. I like many of the things that Chris Kobach says, but he has destroyed his credibility by making so many allegations without evidence. So here's a guy who's educated at Harvard. I believe he has a PhD, incredibly smart, articulate, educated man who one would want to be the face of an immigration restriction movement. One would want someone like this to be the face of an election integrity movement. But he has destroyed his credibility repeatedly by making all sorts of wild accusations without the evidence. And then when he gets called into court to defend his views, he has done such a lousy job. So now it just destroys a case for voter fraud among neutral parties. Now, this time around, ironically, there may really be voter fraud. But after crying wolf for decades, Republicans are in a difficult place precisely because of their own irresponsible rhetoric and failure to provide evidence and follow through to do something about an electoral system that is supposedly so wide open to fraud.
Dead voters.
When I was sworn in as Secretary of State in Kansas in January of 2011, my primary objective was to set about drafting the strongest anti-voter fraud law possible in any state and to get it enacted and implemented as quickly as possible. And we succeeded in doing that.
Kobach went to work filing charges. As of now, there are 12 alleged cases of voter fraud. 12. Two of the first cases he filed.
Okay, so I think most everyone in the chat disagrees with me. So who are the Republicans who have provided substantial evidence that would stand up in court about widespread voter fraud, about widespread voting by illegal aliens? Because Chris Kobach has not done it. John Fund has not done it. So who are the Republicans who have come through on this vitally important issue in the past?
Were against Stephen and Betty Gatke.
My guess is that if Betty's had a speeding ticket, it was many, many years ago.
That's Betty Gatke's lawyer, Trey Petlin. He practices in Olathe, Johnson County, Kansas.
I defend people mostly in Kansas and Missouri in criminal cases, and I also handle personal injury cases.
And this was definitely Petlin's first case of voter fraud. Betty and Steve Gatke are both retired from the Postal Service.
Betty is a proud Native American Indian, a registered Republican. She's very civic-minded. And then Steve is retired military.
In late 2015, an officer arrived at their house asking about the 2010 election, and then he had them arrested.
And the moment he read them their Miranda rights, I can tell you they were concerned. Originally.
And a friend of mine notes that every Sunday, every football Sunday that Joe Biden gets under his belt as presumed winner whittles away half of any interest in Trump court battles among Trump supporters. By next Sunday, it will be down to 25% among hardcore MAGA country. 2 weeks, it will be statistically insignificant. We'll see. This is a golden opportunity for Republicans to gather evidence of substantial voter fraud and to make a case with evidence that they have failed to make for decades, and then build on that into legislation to reduce the odds of such rampant voter fraud happening again, if indeed rampant voter fraud was significant this time round. So I'm listening to a New Yorker podcast here from 2017.
It was a charge that they had used an absentee ballot to double vote in Kansas when they had also voted in the election in Arkansas. They had to think back, but in 2010, they were in the process of moving. Betty had already moved to Arkansas. Steve still lived in Kansas, traveling to Arkansas quite a bit during this voting period. Ultimately, Betty never voted in Kansas. That was a mistake. She was innocent. Her case was dismissed. Steve voted by absentee ballot in Kansas, and he thought he could vote in Arkansas because he moved to Arkansas and he wasn't voting for any of the same candidates.
Voting crimes are often felonies, but Steve eventually pleaded guilty to a Class C misdemeanor, the lowest misdemeanor charge in Kansas.
Naturally, Steve and Betty were both embarrassed and disgruntled. You know, these are people that believe in the system.
So what's going on in Georgia? The GOP holds both houses of the state legislature in Georgia. In Michigan, the GOP holds both houses of the state legislature. In Pennsylvania, the GOP holds both houses, and in Wisconsin. So is the GOP terrified to use their power, or do they understand that they don't have a case to make, and that crying fraud is, and filing lawsuits in this case, perhaps it's just a way of assuaging Donald Trump's ego? I don't know. Maybe there is a significant voter fraud case to make, and I want to see it. If not, then just assuaging Donald Trump's ego is of no interest to me.
And believe in the government. So they were disillusioned a little bit, and it was a difficult experience, I think, for both of them. And one of the things that I you know, in my research of all of this, as I was defending Betty, it was clear that voting crimes are extremely rare. And not only had I not had one, I hadn't heard of one. I've done criminal defense for 23 years. It's not charged. And the reason it's not charged is because it doesn't happen.
That was Trey Petlin, a Kansas lawyer who defended one woman accused of voter fraud. Of the cases filed in
And Gilbert says these allegations of voter fraud are completely bogus and have absolutely no chance of overturning the result. So I think the second part of your statement is much easier to accept than the first part. Of course, there's going to be some cases of voter fraud in every election. The question is how significant they are. Now, if there is significant voter fraud in the 2020 election, does it have any chance of overturning the election result? So that's the question. And I welcome the evidence. I want the GOP to go out there, get evidence that stands up in court that can serve as a basis for a tightening of our electoral system so that it has more integrity, so that it's more reflective of honest people's votes if there is indeed a widespread voter fraud problem. What I fear is that the GOP will simply whine and complain about voter fraud but fail to provide significant evidence so that people who don't have a dog in the fight are convinced that we have a problem and that it needs fixing.
Kansas, it appears that not one involves an undocumented immigrant. And maybe ironically, most of the accused were registered Republicans. But the issue has become a major talking point for conservatives. And one of the prominent voices on this is John Fund. Fund is a columnist for the National Review, an editor of the American Spectator, and he previously wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of 2 books about threats to our voting system. Do you think voter impersonation is a problem of any scale?
I think in close elections where people know it's going to be close and decisive, I think their temptation, given how difficult it is to catch and detect, the temptation in certain close elections is overwhelming and presents a real danger in some elections where people get desperate and will use any methods. And by the way, voter fraud happens in both political parties. I can take you to counties in Kentucky where Republican voter fraud is rampant. And by the way, it's not $10 a vote. It's not $20 a vote. It's a bottle of bourbon.
So one study from Justin Levitt at Loyola Law School on voting across the country between 2000 and 2014, 14 years, found exactly 31 instances of impersonation fraud out of 1 billion votes cast. Is that not a meaningful study?
No, because it's almost impossible to detect. You know, if you go to the Securities and Exchange Commission and you ask them, how many cases of insider trading violations do you have?
Okay, I don't find John Fund persuasive here. You can't say we can't make a case that there's substantial electoral fraud because it's hard to make this case. That's not persuasive to anyone. Is it persuasive to you?
They will tell you, we know there's a lot of them, but we know it's almost impossible to detect unless we have an informant or somebody squeals. So you could go.
So it would seem that if voter fraud is the problem you say it is, you do the hard work. Even though it's difficult, you'll still dig it up.
Ask people how many insider trading convictions the SEC has conducted the last few years, and it's a small number.
No, a very small number. Because the studies, researchers at Wisconsin and Stanford have noted that the number of reported incidents of voter impersonation is about equal to the number of reported incidents of alien abduction. So
Okay, so voter impersonation is going to be tiny because look at the price. Look at the price that you pay is a felony conviction and a ruined life. And what's the upside of what you do? 1 vote. 1 vote almost never changes an election. So voter impersonation and individuals choosing to buck the rules and risk a felony conviction to cast 1 vote, there's just no rational reason to believe that that is widespread.
Going on, do you think that these political scientists and the many, many others who have studied this issue are deliberately misrepresenting the facts?
No, what I'm saying is proving it, showing it is very difficult because once you put the ballot in.
Okay, proving it and showing it is difficult. So do the difficult work. Almost everything that's meritorious is difficult.
In the box, it's anonymous. So the only way to stop voter impersonation is to stop it from happening in the first place. Do we know how much there is? No, because it's almost impossible to detect and catch.
I want to ask you about the National Voter Registration Act, what people usually call the motor voter law. George H.W. Bush, the senior Bush, refused to sign it. But it went into law during the Clinton administration, and Republicans have been fighting about it ever since. What, in your view, is the problem with the law?
Enforcement.
Yes.
Well, of course we want people to be able to register to vote easily. We even give them postcards to do it. The postcards are standardized. That's fine. But we gave the state the responsibility to keep their voter rolls clean. And the federal government had the responsibility to sue the states if they didn't keep their voter rolls clean. So this is part of the law that means, of course, it should be easy to register to vote. But if people don't vote or they're voting illegally over an extended period of time or their names are no longer valid, we have to cull the rolls. There has been no enforcement of that since 2008.
John, at what point you claimed that thanks to the motor voter law, 8 of the 9/11 hijackers were registered to vote. This is you talking about that on Morning Joe some years ago.
8 of the 9/11 hijackers, 8 of the 19 hijackers are registered to vote because they'd gotten driver's licenses.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Now, that's a pretty explosive claim. It's also not true, but it gets to one of the arguments you've made about the voter law, that linking the voter registration process to the process of getting a license.
Okay, so John Fund made this explosive charge on national TV, and in his book, came out in 2004 initially and reissued in 2009. So how well does he back it up?
Could lead to abuse. Do you think that
Well,
it's
David,
too
let's-
easy? Let me
David,
finish.
let me
do you
explain.
think that it's too easy to
David,
register to vote in this country?
You accused me of reporting a falsehood. I would simply tell you, some of them, it was not 8. It was a lower number. In
What was the
addition,
number?
You're asking me to report something that was 15 years old.
He's asking you to report on something that you made the lead of your book on voter fraud, John Fund. That's why me, a sympathetic reader who wants to believe that Donald Trump was robbed by voter fraud. Okay, I'm reading your book. I'm on your side politically, and I just don't find you credible. You lead your book with this allegation. You go on national TV with this allegation, and this is the pathetic way you try to support your case.
What's the number? If it's a lower number than 8, what is the number?
Well, give me time to research it then, because you're asking me a question.
Give you time to research it. You led your book with this allegation. You've written 2 books about voter fraud. You've pronounced this on national TV.
Out of the blue after 15 years. How much do you remember of what you reported 15 years ago?
Quite a lot.
Well, you have a better memory than I do. My source was someone inside the Justice Department, a top official. Obviously, it was on background, and I can't give you that person's name.
But it was wrong.
It's certainly the number.
Wow. He based that explosive allegation on just one source, and he didn't do any follow-up work to validate what the source told him. I mean, how reckless is John Fund?
The number was wrong, yes. It was not that high.
Were any of them?
Yes. You can. We know several of them have driver's licenses. We know that. They were driving.
One reason election officials are cautious about trying to clean up the registration polls is because of the real risk of mistakenly purging rightfully registered voters, right? Here in New York, our City Board of Elections just admitted it accidentally purged more than 100,000 voters from the rolls last year. Are you worried about that too?
Well, that is why over a third of my book involves cases of bureaucratic incompetence. I actually believe we need to spend more money and more resources and take more care with our elections. We need to have more sophisticated voting machines rather than the tinker toy things that we buy. And we need to have better voter rolls. And we need to also train a whole new generation of poll workers, because the average generation of poll workers we have now working the polls is 70 years old. They're not going to be with us forever.
I guess, John, what I want to know is, do you think that there's a really concerted effort afoot of real voter fraud? I'm not saying that there aren't isolated incidents. We can agree on that, and we know that the numbers of it are quite small, to the point of insignificance, the way I see it. But do you really think that there's a concerted effort to vote illegally in this country, and that's significant, and that is something that should be a consuming national issue, as opposed to voter suppression on the other side of the coin?
I think as Chris Dodd, the senator from Connecticut, who was the co-sponsor of the Help America Vote Act, the last bipartisan legislation in this, he said we can do both things at the same time. We can make it easy.
Okay, so John Fund is going to be the face of Republican voter fraud allegations, publishing 2 books on the topic, giving countless interviews on the topic. He just does not seem competent. John Fund, Chris Kobach have made pathetic cases for their allegations.
Vote, and we can make it hard to cheat. I agree with Chris Dodd. What I want to emphasize here is there's common ground, but there are people here who don't want us to reach common ground, some on the right and some on the left. Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Andy Young had a civil rights conference 2.5 years ago in Austin, Texas. They proposed the Freedom Card. They said we shouldn't be spending all of this money on lawsuits and, who has a voter ID and who doesn't. Let's create a freedom card. Let's convert the Social Security card into an ID card for voting purposes only with a photograph on it. The cost would be minimal. And let's issue that to everyone who doesn't have an ID. Because as Andy Young told me, if people don't have an ID in this country, I don't know how many there are, but if anyone who does, they can't participate in the mainstream of American life. They can't travel. They can't get government benefits. They can't cash a check. Let's get them an ID. And I have proposed this to many of the civil rights groups that are fighting these laws. Let's not fight about whether there should be a law. Let's get everyone an ID. I've had very little interest in this. They apparently want to spend their money on litigation and lawsuits.
John, do you think that the federal government should be at the center of this? Would that be a good way to standardize?
No, because the Constitution argues against that. The Constitution specifically lodges responsibility for the time, manner, and place of elections with the states.
A big reason supporters of Trump's commission say that we need to focus on looking into this problem is because nobody knows exactly how many votes are cast fraudulently. It's true that it's very difficult to account for every single ballot every single year. That's absolutely true. But
so let's have preventive measures.
Isn't saying nobody knows how much fraud there is just a way to sow doubt in the system and justify putting up barriers to vote, which also happens?
And in the chat, Bernard says any election without ID is simply not credible. Well, you have to provide evidence that election without ID has produced significant amounts of voter fraud. And people making these allegations have so far failed to produce that evidence.
Is it possible to know anything about this?
We don't know how much tax evasion there is in this country, but we try to have a good faith effort to try to put up enough risks for people that no one will commit tax evasion lightly. We don't catch nearly as many people as practice tax evasion, but at least they know there's some consequences for some people.
Do you think this issue is as important as what we've experienced in 2016, the issue of hacking?
I'm as concerned about the Russian hacking of our elections or the attempted hacking as I am of the mass unmasking of people caught up in NSA surveillance dragnets by Samantha Power and other officials in the Obama administration. I think both are of concern and we both should look at them.
John Fund, thank you very much.
Thank you.
John Fund is author of Stealing Elections and co-author of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk.
Okay, I don't think he made a very good case. You'd think he would have been better prepared. Anyway, here's an interesting thread. Fox called Arizona for Biden, which is a huge leap, but Fox is refusing to call Ohio or Texas for Trump. What is going on at the network? And here's a Twitter thread. Here's the answer. The vice president of Fox political content is Bill Salmon. If you remember the 2014 Senate comprehensive immigration reform effort, the one that cost Eric Cantor his seat to Dave Bratt, it was Bill Salmon, who was the D.C. operative who organized the Fox operation to support it. And you had Marco Rubio going on Bill O'Reilly to support this comprehensive immigration reform. Bill Salmon, on behalf of Rupert Murdoch, coordinated meetings between Marco Rubio, the aligned pitchman, and several media people. It was a coordinated effort. Tucker Carlson, Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, and Neil Cavuto were key. The Fox hosts were then given instructions to sell the Senate bill. This relationship eventually bled into Fox supporting Marco Rubio in the 2016 election. It was a quid pro quo. Fox News' Rupert Murdoch wanted the Senate amnesty bill on behalf of his Wall Street interests, specifically the U.S. Chamber of Commerce President Tom Donahue. Plan was interesting because it required the use of Eric Cantor's wife, Diana, who was working for Tom Donahue at the time. Rubio pushed the 2013-2014 amnesty bill in Congress, and Salmon organized the Fox pundit narrative. Not surprisingly, Bill Salmon's daughter, Brooke, became the communications director for Marco Rubio's presidential bid in 2016. Mickey Kaus was chastised by Tucker Carlson, a Fox contributor and now primetime show host, for writing an article in the Daily Caller outlining the relationship. Mickey Kaus outlined Rupert Murdoch, his company Fox News, the talking heads under his control and authority, and Murdoch's request for pro-amnesty propaganda to be broadcast on the network. Tucker Carlson took down the article from the Daily Caller, and subsequently Mickey Kaus quit in disgust over the agenda-driven editorial decision. Apparently, some things are just too sensitive for sunlight and exposure. Rupert Murdoch, Wall Street, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the entire GOP apparatus, including then House Speaker Paul Ryan were 100% behind comprehensive immigration reform to include amnesty. This is the 2013-2014 origin of the Fox-Ryan relationship. Back to Fox News and their election debate agenda. The executive in charge of Fox News debate programming, debate questioning, and debate structure, as well as all election reporting, is Vice President Bill Salmon. The Washington Post has described how Bill Salmon runs the entire show at Fox regarding politics, how he is the person who Chris Stierwalt, Megyn Kelly, Chris Wallace, and Brett Baier directly reported or report to for all issues, construction, and organization. Now take this background information and overlay it against Rupert Murdoch's response to the 2016 Republican debates and the attempted hit job on Trump by Megyn Kelly. There is a particular clarity that resonates now. Rupert Murdoch tweeted, "Great debate, all did well. Carson, Bush, others did well. Perhaps Rubio best of all. With all doing well, Trump did not stand out like the past." Mr. Rupert Murdoch was also leading the executive decision-making on Fox programming and giving Bill Salmon his orders, also contracted pollster Frank Luntz to appear on Fox News broadcasting in the 2015-2016 election cycle. Frank Luntz had subcontracts with Rubio and a long relationship going back to the senator's time in the Florida legislature. Marco Rubio paid Frank Luntz more than $350,000. It's not accidental that Luntz focus groups regularly find Rubio the winner of debate and opinion programming. Rupert Murdoch was intensely against the candidacy of Donald Trump, so much so that he instructed former president of Fox News, Roger Ailes, to shape favorable coverage toward anyone other than Trump, including a request to tilt support for Hillary Clinton. And that, my friends, is why Fox News attempts to undermine President Trump in these election cycles. Once you see the strings on the marionettes, you can never go back to the time when you did not see them. And let me play a little bit here from the famous Marco Rubio talking to Bill O'Reilly.
Proposed new immigration law is going to be taken up for debate in the Senate. That's been approved. Are you optimistic this is going to pass? You want it to pass in some form. Are you optimistic that's going to happen this year?
Well, I think it depends on border security, and it depends on ensuring that it doesn't cost the American taxpayer. I think the bottom line is if we can secure the border and ensure that this never happens again, and if we can ensure...
Okay, the volume is way too low on that. But you can see how Fox was all in on comprehensive immigration reform and never really was particularly supportive of Donald Trump. Okay, I want to go back to the New Yorker. They've got a podcast here, 3 Views of Voter Fraud from 2017.
The argument that voter fraud is meant to be concealed, therefore you can't find it, is sort of ridiculous. I mean, all crimes are meant to be concealed.
Right.
So
kind of money laundering is meant to be concealed.
Right, or any kind of a fraud is meant to be concealed. So we have that challenge with all kinds of crimes and fraud and detecting them, and we have methods for doing that.
Lorraine Maniti is a professor of political science who spent years researching claims of fraud in our electoral system. Her conclusions are apparent right from the title of her 2010 book, The Myth of Voter Fraud. She spoke with New Yorker staff writer Jelani Cobb.
So, Lorraine, what did you find when you started looking into claims of voter fraud?
Well, I should say it was a really difficult research project because there isn't a singular kind of a database that tracks cases of voter fraud. So I had to go through a process of looking for it where I thought it would show up. So I would start with asking secretaries of state and
Isaiah says in the chat, Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Atlanta, these governments are crime syndicates. Crime is what they do 24/7, 365 days a year. Okay, where's the evidence? There would be abundant evidence because you're dealing here particularly with a lot of low IQ people who you should be able to get access to and get them to turn state evidence. So I think that's a possibility. Maybe these governments are crime syndicates. We just have not the evidence yet. Another possibility is that Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Atlanta are incompetent governments. So I think much of what is wrong with our voting fraud detection and with our voting system is incompetence. I think incompetence is probably a much greater issue than voter fraud. Looking at the chat, Jocko says there's no point in fighting within this system with the coming demographic shift. The odds of saving Trump right now are almost nil. Just burn the credibility of the whole system. Senate majority will mean nothing. Biden already announced several executive orders. Well, Senate majority still means something even if the president issues executive orders. It will severely constrain Biden's ability to govern, just like it did Obama. Obama, after 2010, did not accomplish much except for his executive orders. If he'd had the Senate and if he'd had the House, he would have accomplished a lot more, as he did in his first 2 years in office. Robert says the Republican establishment will pretend Trump never happened and focus on using our system of government to defend the class interests of America's internal enemies. Well, I think this is still Trump country. And I do believe that Trumpism, meaning trade protection and immigration restriction, is the only viable path forward for the Republican Party. Rodney Martin says the evidence is being presented. Remember the 200, 120-year-old voters. I saw that allegation. That's not sufficient, right? You said there's an allegation. I know there's evidence towards that. That's not sufficient evidence, right? Some Twitter posts and some Twitter videos and some apparent malfeasance or incompetence. Okay, that's just the beginning. It's got to be evidence that stands up in court. It's got to be evidence that stands up to scrutiny. Isaiah says there have been a long list of prosecutions and convictions. Where is the evidence is an ignorant question. Okay, I will leave that to the viewer to decide. That because there have been prosecutions and convictions in those cities does not mean that those governments are organized crime syndicates or criminal syndicates. You have prosecutions and convictions in every major city in the United States. Some of you have a really low bar of evidence. It could be just like a Twitter post, and you're convinced because you want to believe. Evidence is stuff that stands up in court and that stands up to scrutiny by people who don't have an agenda in the matter. They are on Philadelphia voter rolls. Okay, that's not enough. We need substantiation that stands up in court and that stands up to cross-examination, and it needs to be compiled. Republicans have just been making these wild accusations about voter fraud for decades. They could never be bothered to put it together into a compelling form. There is no such person who doesn't have an agenda. Every person has an agenda. Yeah, every person has agendas, but not everybody has agendas in the same issue, right? There's only so much that you can care about. And so there are people who care passionately about football and don't care about politics. Other people who care passionately about some aspects of politics but don't care about religion. Other people care passionately about religion, and other people, and those people don't care very much about politics. So some people are relatively open-minded on certain topics. They don't have an agenda on certain topics. They have an agenda in one area of life. Luke, sounding like a real fool sometimes. You miss your calling as an establishment man. Okay, Isaiah, you made the accusation that 4 of America's biggest cities are criminal syndicates. So present the evidence. I mean, email it to me. There would be monumental books written about this. So present it. That because a particular mayor or city council person was convicted does not mean that the city is a criminal syndicate. I'm not sure I've forgotten your religion, Isaiah, but I know that in your religion, there were members of your religion who were convicted of crime. So I could stand here and say your religion, your religious faith is a criminal organization. And I could make just as much of a case as you could that these 4 American big cities are criminal organizations. Like any religion, I could stand here and say whether it's Presbyterianism, Methodism, Judaism, Catholicism, Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, I could sit here and make a case that these religions are criminal organizations. And I could find evidence of leading members of those religions committing crimes, being prosecuted for crimes, and being convicted of crimes. But that individual members or even individual leaders of an organization committed crimes or were prosecuted for crimes does not mean that the entire entity is a criminal organization. They literally memed an imbecile into office. If a political party is based on big taxation, big government is always a crime syndicate. I think that's absurd. You have some of the highest rates of social trust in some of the biggest government countries in the world, the Scandinavian countries. We've had astronomical tax rates and also very low rates of corruption. They've on a world transparency index, Scandinavian countries have done really well, even though they have huge rates of proportionate government spending. So no, I don't think that stands up.
Attorneys generals in the state, and
here.
I sent a survey to every district attorney in the United States. I asked them, how many cases do you have of XYZ, registration fraud, of double voting, voter impersonations? I did interviews with election officials, and I just kept looking and looking and looking and couldn't find it. I couldn't find it. And I will say, since 2010, when my book was published, I have served as an expert witness in 8 federal voting rights cases and a state case. So there have been 9 cases that have been dealing with, say, challenges to voter ID laws. You can read the legislative record in the states when they debate the voter ID laws that have been passed. You can look at the court records on these cases. No state has been able to show that they've had any kind of a problem with voter fraud. So it's not just me, looking for it and maybe making mistakes somehow and not finding it. I mean, I have looked for years, and I have looked in multiple ways, and I have tried to reason through where would it show up if it were happening and look there, and no one else has come up with it.
But you take a pretty significant stand on it. I mean, the title of the book is The Myth of Voter Fraud.
Right.
And
right.
So if this is a kind of mythology, then what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, I think...
So I am eager to believe that this election was stolen from Donald Trump. I'm eager to believe that. I'm eager to believe what Isaiah said, all right? That these major democratic cities are criminal organizations. I am eager to believe that. And I am eager to believe that there is massive voter fraud, because I suspect if there is massive voter fraud, it's being carried out in Democratic-run cities. I just need to see more evidence beyond a Twitter post. Chris says the statistical abnormalities in just all the right states at exactly the right time after they stop releasing the votes is a very convincing evidence of malfeasance, but it won't stand up in court. I don't think it's evidence. It's interesting. It's intriguing. To me, it's not evidence, because these states, I believe, that we're talking about all have Republican legislatures that prohibited the counting of mail-in ballots prior to Election Day. So, therefore, these mail-in ballots piled up, and it was the votes cast on Election Day that were counted first, and then they get to the mail-in ballots. So I don't see coincidences as evidence, but they do point towards investigating these coincidences to find the evidence. If I see a repeating pattern of events, I interpret that based on human nature. I do not form my views of the world based on the principle beyond reasonable doubt. I 100% agree with you. 100%, Isaiah. Chris says, what can stand up in court is allegations that the law was broken, which it was in Pennsylvania. It seems to me more likely that they could change the laws in future elections, but won't reverse this one. And Bernard says, I've not seen anything firm that the American election was stolen. I haven't seen enough to believe that yet. I am eager to believe it. I want to believe it. I need to see more evidence. 500% turnout among Democrats and only in swing states. That's simply not true. There was not 500% turnout. Now, I've seen allegations that Wisconsin had 90% voter turnout, and then I've read other ways of looking at the statistics saying it was more like 70%. I would find 90% turnout in a state very, very difficult to believe. What about all the dead voters? That is concerning. So that should be in a court case. That should be put into evidence, submitted to a court. And even if you don't win the court case, that should be compiled into scholarly articles, into articles for law reviews. It should be compiled into scholarly books, and legislative steps should be taken to prevent it from happening again. Biden, a twice failed candidate, blew past FDR and Obama. Okay, that's weird. I absolutely believe that's weird. Like, why would so many people vote for what would qualify as evidence? Okay, one is not the only thing, but one is something that stands up in court. You present arguments to a court. You put something in a court filing, and it is considered by the court, and the court rules, takes into consideration your evidence in their ruling. That's one example. Another example of what counts for evidence is that it is widely regarded as persuasive by people who examine it, not just those who want to believe it, but also those without a particular dog in the fight. So think about the amazing career that you could make as a journalist, putting together the case that, say, Atlanta is a criminal organization. The city of Atlanta is a criminal organization. The city of Milwaukee is a criminal organization. That the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. That is a massive story. That would make a career. You would make millions of dollars if you could make that compelling case. So make it. Put it into a book. And make it. So scholars could make a whole career if they are able to substantiate such allegations. So I'm eager to believe in massive voter fraud in 2020, and I see lots of examples of what appears to be voter fraud. Now it needs to be put together in a compelling fashion that, one, stands up in court, and two, stands up to scrutiny by critics, so that people who are otherwise not emotionally engaged in the topic look at it and they find it persuasive. Am I interested in covering the Ed Buck trial, supposed to start in January? Ed Buck was a weird guy who got off on injecting black prostitutes with drugs. I don't see the greater significance. He's called a major donor to the Democratic Party, but I mean, how much money did he actually give? Less than $1 million. So I don't see how he's terribly significant. Isaiah says the reputations that Chicago and Detroit have are conspiracy theories. No, Chicago and Detroit have reputations of being failed governments, incompetent, failed governments with a lot of bad policies, and cities with the demographics of Chicago and Detroit struggle. I don't know any cities with the demographics of Detroit that are flourishing. So again, I don't think it's primarily a matter of the government. I think it's primarily a matter of the demographics. What cities with Detroit's demographics are flourishing? Anywhere in the world. I'm unaware of any city in the world with Detroit's demographics that is flourishing. So let me look it up on Wikipedia right now. So the demographics of Detroit. And where are the racial demographics? I'm getting the religious demographics. Okay, race. So Detroit in 2010 is 10% white. It's 83% black, 7% Hispanic, 1% Asian. Okay, so show me cities in the world with an approximately tiny percentage of whites and Asians, 83% African American or black or more, and show me thriving cities. So I don't think Detroit's problems are primarily a function of its government. It's an 83% black city. Show me examples of flourishing 83% black cities. Ah, yes, failed government sounds so much better than crime syndicate. You don't understand the difference between incompetence and criminality, between failure and criminality. To me, there's all the world of a difference between saying that a government is incompetent or failed and saying that it's a organized criminal enterprise. To me, night and day difference. But what does the audience think? Do you understand a difference, a significant difference between failure and criminal intent, between incompetence and active criminal organization? But it's not even the government. Show me successful cities with an 83% or more black population. And I'm looking in the chat and no one can answer my question. So it doesn't have anything to do with the government in Detroit. This is just a matter of demographics. Has nothing to do with criminality in the government. This is demographics. And what are the demographics of Chicago? All right. So demographics of Chicago, it is 45% white, 33% black, and 29% Hispanic. So the life results for those demographics are what you would expect in Chicago. So again, I don't think Chicago's primary problem is its government. Its primary problem is its demographics, which is not as sexy as saying that there's a criminal syndicate that's operating here. Okay, what are the demographics of the city of Atlanta? The city is 51% black, 41% white, and Atlanta's problems are exactly what you would expect from those kind of demographics. So again, it's not a matter of even government criminality or government incompetence. It's a matter of demographics. And no one can give me examples. I'm going on, 5-10 minutes here asking for examples of successful cities that are 83% black. So the problems of these cities, Isaiah, that you allege are because they are run by criminal governments, it just doesn't stand up. Their problems are obviously demographics, don't have much to do with the government, except to the extent that the government helped to create or foster or encourage the particular demographic makeup.
It's tapping into attitudes that are really deep in American culture and racially charged and class-based attitudes that, certain people shouldn't be allowed to vote. Mm-hmm. And so we perpetuate the idea that...
And Chris says, how about Israel throwing Trump under the bus while Mexico is showing some loyalty? Well, Israel is a lot farther away from the United States than Mexico. So Mexico has more rational reason to fear Donald Trump's wrath than Israel. So Israel is doing the expedient thing, and that is establishing relations with the person who looks to be the new president of the United States. Mexico is much more afraid because Donald Trump is on their doorstep.
There's all this corruption, and that justifies stricter rules about access, and that those stricter rules have disproportionate effects on people who are poor.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So as we talk, there is the kind of swirling issue of the presidential voter fraud initiative and Chris Kobach.
And Isaiah says government exists to prevent crime. Police don't do a lot of crime prevention. They come along after the crime has been committed. So you could have the most sterling government, but if you have a criminally inclined population, it's not going to have a whole lot of success. Now, government can have some effect, but generally speaking, governments do not exist crime. They deal with crime. They can have some marginal influence on crime rates. They can choose to lock up people or to release people who are criminally inclined. But again, generally speaking, governments don't get to dictate crime rates. Demographics are the most important figure for crime rates, not government competency.
Attempting to get voter data from the various states. And if voter fraud is not common or rare in American politics, why does it have the kind of political appeal that it does?
Well, I think there's a kind of institutional bias in our party system. We have this party system with two parties. We don't have proportional representation. We have winner take all. So the logic of that is that you just have to get one more vote than your opponent. That creates incentives to think about demobilizing your opponent's voters. Mm-hmm. So, this is targeting a particular population. You might call it the more marginal population in the United States because it has a partisan overlay. Those people are perceived to be more friendlier to the Democratic Party. And so you have the Republican Party, almost everywhere these laws have been adopted in the United States, pushing for voter ID laws, proof of citizenship laws, because there's an electoral advantage to them if they can keep down the vote of the opponents rather than try to enlarge their majority around their own, policy agenda. So, it's got a very partisan overlay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting that there's this long history that we can look at with African Americans, particularly around poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests and outright physical intimidation to prevent people from voting. But we've also seen that language applied increasingly to Latinos, particularly around the idea of people who are undocumented, who are participating in the electoral system. And one of the things I think I found interesting in your book was you talking about the idea of voter fraud being fundamentally more irrational an act than voting itself is. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It's in the sort of professional study of politics by political scientists, scholars, analysts sort of apply the idea of costs and benefits to voting. And they sort of count up the benefits, and then they look at the cost. And the cost would be in time or effort or education. You have resources and so forth. And they sort of come to a conclusion that actually it's not that rational for any individual, to vote, especially say in a national election, because the likelihood of your one vote determining the outcome is so small that you would say, well, why bother, right? And so the question of committing voter fraud says, well, let's take an almost irrational act, which is voting, and then to say, and what I'm then going to do is I'm going to break a law. I'm going to possibly face, even a felony conviction. If I am a non-citizen certainly an undocumented non-citizen, I'm going to face deportation. To cast one more vote, what do you get for it? What do you actually get for your voting? So
let me say the opposite, the other side of this. In 2012, when Mitt Romney was questioned about why he thought he lost, he made the indelicately phrased statement about Obama having given massive financial gifts to minorities. Isn't that part of the equation when people talk about this, about what the person would benefit would be? There's some guy in a seedy part of town with an envelope full of cash, and he's just kind of distributing it around to get people to show up to vote?
Well, there are cases of that. I mean, there are cases of something called vote buying, and in particular in some poor, isolated communities, there have been examples, even not that long ago, of exactly what you just described. Just a reminder. The problem with that is that with the secret ballot, it's not a very efficient way of trying to rig an election because, anybody could take the money and go in and vote any way you want, right? So how do you guarantee that you're getting what you're paying for? So that's another example of why this is sort of, boneheaded a thing to do.
I do want to think about this historically, though, for a minute. You started this work in 2000, but there have been, scandals and questions around voter integrity in the United States for a long time. And we could look at Tammany Hall or, Huey Long, that kind of incandescently colorful figure of Louisiana politics as well.
No, in the past, we certainly have a colorful history of electoral manipulation, of election fraud broadly, of stealing of ballots and so forth. But that's not where we're at today. Many things have changed since the 19th century and even since the 1920s and the 1930s.
Or even going back to the colonial era, where candidates would, for the colonial legislatures would kind of literally go to the saloons and, get everyone beer and then roll them over to the ballots.
Right. Yeah, so this is very entertaining and interesting history. But even those stories we can tell about Tammany Hall or about even Lyndon Johnson's, everybody likes to talk about Lyndon Johnson's first race for Senate when mysteriously the voters of Alice, Texas kind of lined up in alphabetical order to sign in.
So that is a testament to great local party organization.
That's right.
One of the points that you raise in your book that I found really interesting was about this myth that the 8, I think, of the 19 hijackers on September 11th were registered voters, or this said which I hadn't heard before I read your book. But as I was reading this, I thought, of course someone has said this. This is like, why would someone not make up this idea? But this was an idea that was going around, and it became kind of a stand-in for people's fears about having, I guess, a voting system that was too lax.
Yes, yeah, and that was partly, we can trace it right to the motor voter law, right, which mandates that state agencies that do motor vehicles provide an opportunity for people to register to vote. This was a signature feature of that 1993 piece of legislation. It was one of the first bills that Bill Clinton signed. He was either the first or the second. So, the sort of conservative right-wing, people who went after Clinton his whole time in office were pretty obsessed with the National Voter Registration Act and the idea that it would allow for fraudulent registrations, illegal registrations, mistakes, problems. They're going to pollute the registration rolls. So this idea that the 9/11 hijackers were registered to vote came in part because some of them had used fake driver's licenses, or I think in some cases there were some who had actually legally obtained driver's licenses. So the question was, hey, if they got a driver's license, they had to have been asked, would you like to register to vote? So they could be registered to vote. They are registered to vote, was said on, a couple of television shows in particular.
And this turns out to not be true.
Right.
What do you think we'll see from this commission that's being led by Chris Kobach?
Well, I think we'll see more of what certainly I've seen and other people who study this issue have seen happen, which is to mash up a lot of data as a pretext to arguing that the voter rolls are so polluted and corrupted, and people could be lurking around using false IDs to come in or false names, to get on the rolls and register. And so I think it's about trying to create ongoing chaos on election day in a way. In other words, create an environment in which the public actually is losing confidence, not gaining confidence. I don't think the public is going to gain confidence from whatever comes out of that commission.
Okay, so let's look at the countries that are quick to recognize Joe Biden as the president-elect and countries that are not so quick. So Anatoly Karlin logs, the world map of Biden recognitions is instructive. No surprise that the core blue government-aligned vassals are tripping over themselves to congratulate and to celebrate, happy at the prospect of the gushing service they are prepared to mete out, as opposed to their sullen compliance during the Trump years. More notable, though less remarkable, has been the defection of the red government protectorates despite their obvious preference for Trump, but their security is ultimately too tightly bound up with the United States to play too obvious a part in their internal factional disputes. But hey, at least the U.S. Embassy was moved to Jerusalem and Israel recognized Kosovo. So hopefully the anguished MAGA boomers and Pray for Israel evangelicals populating the replies to Bibi's tweet can take solace in that. Trump went out of his way to publicize a call with Taiwan after his election, sell it weapons, sent a high-ranking official there recently as part of his anti-China policy. Not exactly Netanyahu level, but another insult on his way out, leaders acting like he doesn't exist, referring to a tweet by the leader of Taiwan. Even the Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro, appears to be throwing in the towel, now observing that Trump is not the most important person in the world. Who is hoarding out on offering premature congratulations? Red government-aligned Eastern Europeans such as Slovenia, Poland, and Mexico. Perhaps Trump-arena shouldn't have been so hard on the bad hombres. And unsurprisingly, Russia and China. While Russia obviously has a greater stake in Trump, whereas China has a greater stake in Biden, the dissolution of political unity in the United States is something that benefits both far more. Okay, here's another podcast on voter fraud. This is from the Los Angeles Review of Books. Tom Zellner, the host, talks to Rick Hasen about election law. Rick Hasen is a law professor at the University of California at Irvine and author of 2 books on voter fraud. Our guest today is Professor Richard Hasen, the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. I'm Tom Zollner. Richard Hasen is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, and his latest book is called Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. Professor Hasen, thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you.
Rick, how can you say positively that voter fraud is not a problem?
Well, we went through a number of attempts of people to try to prove that voter fraud was a major problem.
And this was released October 30th, so a few days before the election.
Most prominently, as I describe in Election Meltdown, a trial that was held in Kansas a few years ago, in which the question was, could the state of Kansas pass a law that made it harder for people to register to vote? They'd have to show their papers, their birth certificate or naturalization certificate, in order to stop non-citizen voting. This was the chance for Chris Kobach, a leader among those who argue that voter fraud is a major problem, to come forward with evidence in a court of law proven under the rules of evidence. He could bring in whatever expert witnesses he wanted, whatever evidence he wanted. And in the end of the day, he provided virtually no proof that non-citizen voting was a major problem in Kansas or in the United States. He claimed that what he offered was a tip of the iceberg. At the end of the trial, not only did Kobach not prove that case, the judge found that there was no iceberg, only an icicle made up mostly of administrative error, the same way that some people were listed in voter rolls as being born in 1800. But he was even sanctioned for his conduct in the case in terms of misleading the court. So there was a voter fraud commission that President Trump put together.
So press 1 in the chat if you believe that Donald Trump will still be the president of the United States come January 25, 2021.
That disbanded before it could provide any evidence of voter fraud. So we've given these people 20 years to make their case, and they haven't been able to make it.
Why is this?
And Elliot Blatt says, Luke, do you think your reluctance to embrace the fraud is that you're trying to protect yourself from the emotional pain that it implies? No, I experienced the pain during the election. I want to believe in the electoral fraud. I just need to see more substantial evidence that it was substantive enough to swing the election. So how many people in the chat? Got 4 people in the chat who believe that Donald Trump will still be president come January 25. So, yeah, I think I mourned prior to election night. And then I definitely mourned somewhat on air, but I think I had already emotionally come to terms by election eve that Trump was likely to lose. And I will embrace the fraud allegations as soon as they are substantial. Right now, there seem to be quite a bit of evidence for fraud. What I'm not sure of, was it substantial enough to sway the election? And I don't know what the critics of the fraud allegations have to say in many of these instances. So keeping an open mind, hoping for massive revelations of voter fraud. So QAnon types have talked about how ballots are watermarked, and this is Trump drawing in his critics, and then he's going to do a big reveal. So I'm not terribly impressed by the quality of the attorneys who are arguing Trump's case. He does not seem to be getting the best. So again, I'll keep an open mind to see what kind of recount operation he can mount, what kind of legal challenges he can mount. Certainly, I would much prefer Donald Trump as president of the United States than Joe Biden. And ballot harvesting certainly has enormous potential for voter fraud. But Republicans knew the rules, so if they did not adequately participate in this, then they were incompetent. There's no reason that Republicans could not harvest ballots within the rule of law just as much as Democrats.
Myth, then, so widely believed in some corners of this country.
I think you have to understand that someone like President Trump has repeated claims of voter fraud hundreds of times. And it's become part of at least one segment of Republican.
So when I was watching Trump's final rally in Michigan, I was lying in bed watching Trump's final rally. I had tears in my eyes. So I was very emotionally connected to the moment. I feared that we were seeing the end of the Trump presidency and that this was his last hurrah. And I think my feelings were fairly widespread.
Party orthodoxy that the way that Democrats win elections is by fraud. I think that these statements are made as a pretext to pass laws that make it harder to vote. But when you hear every day that Democrats are cheating, when the president says the only way I can lose this election is if it's rigged, and when there are isolated instances of either fraud or, more commonly, administrative mistakes that somehow get parlayed into fraud, then people tend to believe this. And in fact, there's good public opinion polling that shows that if you're on the losing side of an election, you're much more likely to believe that the election was conducted in an improper way than if you're on the winning side. And so people are really primed to believe this stuff, whether or not there's any evidence to back it up.
Still, your book makes the point that it's really playing with fire to throw around rhetoric like stolen elections. And we see this coming from both sides of the major aisle here in the United States.
Yeah, so in Election Meltdown, just to put this in context, I argue that there are 4 main reasons why there is.
So press 3 in the chat if you believe the people who believe that electoral voter fraud swung this election away from Trump to Biden, if that is primarily an emotional cope, that because reality is so harsh that people want to believe that their rightful candidate was robbed by fraud. So press 3 if you think this is primarily an emotional cope.
A decrease in voter confidence in the election process in the United States and a challenging of the legitimacy of the process. in a belief that we can conduct fair elections. One of those, which we've already discussed, is this focus on voter fraud, which convinces each side that the other side is trying to cheat. But then there's a separate problem, which is the kind of rhetoric that campaigns and candidates on both sides use to talk about elections as rigged or stolen. I mentioned how Trump does this all the time, but it's not just Trump. So there was a close election a few years ago for governor of Georgia, where Brian Kemp, who was the then Secretary of State running for governor as a Republican.
So yes, I find a lot of what went on very suspicious. So I am not committed to saying that voter fraud cost Trump the election, and I'm not committed to denying it. I'm right in the middle. I'm eager for more evidence, and will be following the electoral appeals, the legal appeals, because even if Trump ends up losing, if there is widespread voter fraud, we need to identify it substantially. Republicans have cried for decades about voter fraud and never bothered to accumulate the evidence. So it is vital that we accumulate evidence of voter fraud and then push for legislation to make it less likely to happen in the future.
And ran against Stacey Abrams, a Democrat. Kemp did some things that I found very objectionable, and I described them in the book, but there was no good evidence that what he had done actually stole the election for him. He won that election. And yet you had people like Sherrod Brown, a U.S. Senator from Ohio, saying that the election was stolen. You had Abrams herself saying that she actually won the election. And I think that kind of rhetoric is very problematic and really is worrisome for our democracy, because if people believe that elections are being routinely stolen, why would anyone bother to vote?
Michelle Malkin has interviews with
the
people
German
with tons
author
of
Thomas
evidence.
Mann talked about democracy's deep and forceful recollection of itself. It seems that we might be facing this.
I think we're at a very difficult moment in American democracy. We're about to have an election that both sides see as an existential one, where if the other side wins, it's going to be the end of the United States as we know it. And we know from studies of authoritarianism that when people view elections as so high stakes, there's greater danger. Norms have been eroded. I think Donald Trump is a big part of the problem, but he's not the only one. And it does create a situation where we're highly polarized. Our polarization is amplified on social media, where we tend to hear things that we agree with. And it's even spilled into the streets in some instances. So I do feel that we're at a precipice, and the next 6 months is going to really define where America is going to be for at least the medium term.
A particularly chilling line from your book, you write, the bottom line is that there will be no miracle cures.
Well, it's true in part because the United States has a very odd system for conducting elections. If you look at just about every other advanced democracy, the UK, Canada, Germany, you pick the advanced democracy, they have a national nonpartisan body that runs elections. They don't have what we have, which is 10,500 different election administrative bodies running elections. They, in the other countries, have people whose top allegiance is to the integrity of the election, whereas we run our elections where many partisan election officials, Democrat or Republican, run the elections. And so we're not set up for it. And we have a...
So whatever your perspective is on voter fraud, consider the opposing argument. So if you believe there's massive voter fraud, then read a book on voter fraud by these academic experts who say it is not a big problem. And if you don't believe that there is election fraud, then look at the people who perhaps best articulate the case. So who would you say is best articulating the case for massive voter fraud? I'm not sure, but throw down their names in the chat. So listen to both sides. This is Scott Adams. He believes President Trump still has the advantage.
Now, never mind that Joe Biden did base his campaign on calling Trump supporters effectively Nazis. Now, of course, the Fine People hoax was the center of his campaign. The second part of his campaign was the drinking bleach hoax. But in any case, he has branded all Trump supporters as supporters of basically a Nazi. So after that being your campaign, how exactly are we supposed to feel about this unity stuff? It's a little hard to feel unified when someone has branded you a Nazi and members of your of your party are literally forming lists of Trump supporters.
So Donald Trump has released a tremendous amount of energy. I've gotten a lot of energy to do a lot of my shows because of Trump. And I think there are thousands of people like me who've gotten a lot of energy from Trump. So who's going to perhaps drop out of the pundit sphere or the vlogosphere or the blogosphere or the social media sphere because they were essentially one-trick ponies, or because their energy in either supporting Trump or opposing Trump is what has driven most of their contributions? Mike Cernovich says he's dropping out of politics. So I'll be curious, who are the one-trick ponies who will diminish and perhaps even disappear from public view, and who will continue? So I think Scott Adams has enough interesting things to say that he will continue with something close to, at least 50% of his current prominence, even if Joe Biden becomes president January 20.
So that they can be punished in the future for having political support of Trump. Now, good luck, Joe Biden, getting all your unity. I would say that would be a case of too little too late. Too little too late. A number of world leaders are congratulating Biden, and although we could argue that it's not official, and I will in a little bit, I feel as though you could forgive the leaders who feel this is just sort of the polite time to do it. And I saw some pushback on Netanyahu because he finally congratulated Biden. But I think it's fair to let the other countries just do sort of the standard traditional thing you do when it looks like an election is basically over, according to them. So I don't think we should make too much of that. They're just doing what they need to do to be polite. I don't have a problem with that at all. Did you see all the cities erupting in celebration? I had weird mixed feelings about this, at least preliminary outcome. I'll tell you later why I think it's going to change. But I kind of liked seeing my fellow Americans be happy for the first time in 4 years. It's hard to watch, giant throngs of people being desperately unhappy and depressed, and they think their world is ending, and they think Hitler is running the world, and all that stuff. And even though I was, mostly on the other side from them politically, I kind of enjoyed watching them be happy. I have to admit, I had mixed feelings about that. And all things being considered, if we could find some situation where most people are happier, but maybe I don't get exactly what I want, I'd be okay with that, because I'd rather most people are happier. That would be better than me getting, tax break or something like that. But we'll see if that holds. And of course, there are lots of other variables, aside from being happy and running around in your pajamas in the streets. So let me ask you this. If Biden, let's just say, hypothetically, and I know it's crazy, what I'm going to say next, it's crazy. So just think of this as a thought experiment, not anything that you have to worry about in the real world. Suppose the election got reversed by the courts. Would Biden supporters say, oh, okay, well, we were wrong, I guess?
So Scott Adams is an expert cartoonist. He's good at communicating, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about persuasion. I am highly skeptical that he has anything important to say about what's going to happen with the courts. I am highly skeptical of any legal expertise.
I guess the vote didn't go our way. And now that the vote has been reversed, would they encourage Biden to give a concession speech? Let's say that the count was unambiguously reversed and there was no doubt that Trump had actually won, and it's a big surprise, just hypothetically. Do you think they'd ask Biden to concede? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think it would go that way. But let's talk about, one more thing first. So I saw on Fox News site, they're talking about how Biden is looking to reverse America First policy. Now, the great thing about calling your policy America First, which is what Trump did, is that if anybody tries to reverse it, they're reversing the America First policy, which there's nothing you can say about that sounds good. Because you're thinking, you're the president of the United States. Why would you want to reverse the policy that put the country you're the president of first? So it has that little bit of Antifa quality. The brilliance of Antifa is that they're anti-fascist. So if you're anti-fascist, by definition, you're a fascist. That's how words work. Well, Trump has one of those working for him. America First. I'd like to reverse that. Oh, you would? Well, that doesn't sound too good, does it? So Biden would have to deal with that if he indeed becomes sworn in as our president. But how likely is that? Now, when last I updated the slaughter-meter, it was at 100% prior to the actual election. I haven't updated it, but I did say subsequent to that it's closer to 60-40, 40-60. I'm going to keep my odds of Trump eventually becoming a second-term president in 2020 at 60%, which is 50% better than Biden's chances. And I will now make my argument for why Trump actually has a 60% chance of becoming president still, much better than Biden does. You ready for this? Now keep in mind some context, right? So some of the context is about me as a public prognosticator, I guess. So keep in mind that when I predicted Trump would win I was treated as an idiot for a full 18 months. But then it came through. Keep in mind that when I said Kamala Harris would be the candidate, even after she dropped out of the primaries, I had to endure many months of people saying, geez, Scott, can you just give it up? And then, of course, she became the vice presidential pick. And most people, including Democrats, would say she's sort of the real president or will be or something. So I would say I stuck that one out against all odds. Likewise, when the Vegas shooter was thought to be ISIS before we knew who it was, I said it's not ISIS. And then ISIS took credit. ISIS took credit for the Vegas shooting. And still, after ISIS took credit, I said it wasn't ISIS. And then it wasn't. So keep in mind that I have a track record of 3 ridiculous public predictions. Ridiculous. And you could argue that all 3 came in. The Kamala Harris one is more of a judgment call. So because I kind of like when that happens, I'm going to stay with it. So I'm going to stay with my prediction that despite losing the election, Trump will more likely win the election in the end. The most unlikely, ridiculous, I would say almost reckless prediction, would you say? Really crazy. That's where I like to be. I like to be in crazy place. And here we see in the comments that I am delusional. That's where I want to be. So if you're thinking right now, oh, you know, you got lucky a few times, I'll give you that. I'll give you that you did get lucky on some big ones. But you're just really freaking crazy now. You know, this time, Scott, you're crazy. Could be. Entirely possible. I give that a full possibility. But here's my argument, and when I'm done, see if it changes your mind, okay? Here's what would have to be true in order for the election to be overturned. Are you ready? So see which of these individual things that I talk about you disagree with me. Because if you don't disagree on any of the individual things, you might want to agree with me on the big picture that they create. So individually, would you say that Democrats had a motive to cheat in the election? Well, everybody, did they have a motive?
Of course.
Yes. Not only did they have a motive, they had the motive of all motives. Indeed, has there ever been a motive to do anything illegal that was better or stronger than this motive? Remember, half of the country was having mental illness that was extreme because of this president, and they wanted to get out of that feeling. Plus, they had convinced the public and themselves that Trump was basically Hitler. And if you had a choice, if you had a chance, let's say, to break a rule or a law, and you might even go to jail if you got caught, but if you break this law, you could remove Hitler from office without any bloodshed. Would you do it? Would you be motivated to break a law if you thought the result of breaking that law was removing Hitler from office? Of course you would. I would. Let me say as clearly as possible, if I believed what the Democrats believe, that Trump is Hitler, and I could find a way to fudge the election and break the law to get rid of that guy, I would do it. Is there anybody here who wouldn't do that? Because let me say, if you wouldn't do that, you're kind of an asshole. Because you would let Hitler come to, you wouldn't take a little bit of chance to get Hitler out of office? Really? I think you would take that chance. Most of you would. So on the question of did they have a motive, I think that's 100% yes. We'd all be on the same page on that, right? I think even Democrats would agree that given the extent of their feelings, the motive part is pretty solid. But motive isn't enough, right? Just having a motive doesn't prove anything. We have all kinds of motives to do lots of things, but we don't do them because we don't want to go to jail or maybe it's not possible. So motive, I think, yes, and emphatically yes. In fact, more motive than there's ever been motive for anything in the world of motives. It's the number one motive thing other than, I don't know what. Could there be a higher motive than this? I can't think of one. All right, what about the opportunity? Because they'd have to be able to do it. There would have to physically be a way to do it. Do you believe that there is physically, that it's actually possible that they could have changed enough votes to rig the election in their favor? Now, I would say that there are some things, some specific kinds of fraud that you really couldn't do in gigantic numbers because of the nature of it. It would just be hard to scale some sorts of things up. But is it impossible to change the programming of whatever is counting the votes? Is that impossible? If insiders thought they were getting rid of Hitler and they had the power to change the software code, would it be impossible to do it? No, nobody thinks that software is impossible to hack, right? Nobody thinks that employees are impossible to bribe, or maybe they don't even need a bribe because they want to get rid of Trump too. So certainly you could get people who are insiders, who have access to everything. You could certainly get insiders to do what you wanted them to do because they probably want to do it anyway. If you didn't blackmail them, if you didn't bribe them, they just want to do it anyway. It's easy. The programming ability.
Okay, so great question in the chat. Assuming Trump loses, press 1 if this is due to rejection by the Wignat 5%. 2, if this is due to Trump's handling of COVID. 3, white professionals getting gaslit by the media. But I don't think Trump would have beaten Biden in 2016. Biden was always going to be very, very difficult for Trump to beat. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I think Trump would have beaten Biden in 2020 without COVID. So I don't think it's necessarily Trump's handling of COVID. I'm thinking COVID is probably responsible for Trump losing in 2020. But Biden was always going to be very difficult to beat. And I think Biden would have beaten Trump in 2016 with the with the advantage of incumbency, Trump may well have beaten Biden in 2020 without COVID, but Biden, with his appeal to working class whites, was always going to be very difficult for Trump to beat. So Trump may well have lost to Biden. It would have been a very difficult victory even without COVID.
If you had access to it and you had the intention of doing it, would be easy. So there wouldn't be any hard technical problem involved, right? Now, suppose you wanted to do it in a more grotesque way, not an elegant, graceful way. Suppose you just wanted to show up with a bunch of, this has been reported on social media, and we don't know how true it is, but it's just been reported on social media, so I'll just put it out there in a what if. Is it possible, I'm not saying it happened, we're just talking whether it could be done, to arrive in the middle of the night with trucks full of ballots that have been filled out for one candidate for not the other? Is it physically possible that they would show up and do some massively obvious thing, like have all the ballots in the truck be for one candidate? Could you do it? Well, you could do it. The risk is getting caught, right? That's the risk. But could you do it? I feel like you could. Now, maybe later they would be reversed or something. Maybe you get caught. But it's certainly physically possible. Would you all agree that if you don't look at, we'll look at this separately, but if you don't look at the risk of getting caught, you could hack it, you could have an insider, you could deliver fake ballots, you could rig the counting machines, right? Physically, it's possible. We also have lots of evidence of individual local races that have been rigged in the past, right? We also have Blagojevich. Do you remember Blagojevich? He was, if I have the story right, he was the governor of Illinois. Went to jail because he tried to sell a Senate seat. Now, that's a guy who knows government corruption. He was corrupt. He went to jail for it. He tried to sell a Senate seat because as governor, he was able to, I think he had the right to fill a Senate seat with a Republican or Democrat or whatever he was. Democrat? Yeah, I guess Democrat. So he had a choice of doing that, and he offered it up for sale. Now, his opinion, and he just offered this yesterday, I think, is that the Democratic cities have been faking elections for decades, and that it's not something that happens once in a while. It's the normal baseline, right? So now, do you believe Blagojevich, who went to...
Okay, so I don't believe Blagojevich. That argument that Democrats have been faking elections for decades, you could make a career exposing that, right? There's no evidence that that's happened. It's very easy to say anything, but where's the evidence? There isn't evidence that Democrats have been fixing elections for decades and decades. Think about the millions of dollars that you would make if you're able to expose that. Think of all the incentives for anyone who participated in that to expose it. You can't keep those kind of secrets for decades and decades through a relatively large number of people. This is not something that's been done by one person. Let's imagine that the Democrats have been rigging elections in their big cities for decades. That would require the cooperation and assistance of hundreds of people. And none of them have come forward with evidence about this. So I don't find that persuasive.
To jail for state corruption. He went to jail for it. So you got to feel that he might have known some other people who might be sort of in that mindset or doing those kinds of things. So he says, oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. It's basically every major Democrat city. It's every time, and they've been doing it forever. That's a pretty big claim, isn't it? By a person who you would imagine would be close enough to things to know that that's true or false. Now, Trump did, I don't know if he commuted his sentence or pardoned him or whatever the word is, but...
It's very easy to make claims. What is more challenging is to present evidence for the claims. I could make a claim that I was abducted by an alien last week for 3 hours, but it'd be much more difficult to provide evidence for that.
Trump did get him out of jail before his term was over. So, Blagojevich has maybe some reason to be, nice to Trump in return. But I don't know if he would make a claim like that. That's such a big claim, that all the major Democratic cities are rigged elections. That's a really big claim. I don't know that he would do that just as to return a favor. It's just such a big claim. So we have opportunity, we have motive. So the only thing that's sort of missing is, do you think they could get away with it? So if you believe they have motive, you believe they had the opportunity, then the only thing that would stop them is thinking that they would get caught. Or you might think that they will get caught and it just hasn't happened yet. Do you think that Democrats who, let's say Blagojevich is right, let's say they've been cheating in every major city.
Okay, so hundreds of people would have been necessary to carry out this kind of massive cheating. And one of them would not have come forward with evidence of this? I don't buy it.
Every election for decades. Would they be worried about getting caught? I wouldn't be worried about getting caught if it's the same crime I've been doing for 40 years.
And by the way, I did not have these views 2 days ago. It's just that I spent the weekend reading books on voter fraud. And so I've shifted over the past 2 days to becoming much more skeptical of claims of voter fraud unless there is compelling evidence.
I don't worry about that at all. I'd be like, well, they didn't catch me last year. They didn't catch me.
And I'm talking about voter fraud that is significant. I'm not talking about an individual here and an individual there. I'm talking about thousands of votes being shifted through fraud. So more skeptical now than I was last week, because since last week, I've read books on the topic. I've listened to podcasts on the topic by academic experts on the topic, and that has shifted me towards a more skeptical position.
The year before, and they didn't catch me the 39 times before that. I think I'll take another go at it, right? So somebody's reminding me that Blagojevich was backfilling Obama's Senate seat that he...
Okay, and so the chat says means, motive, and opportunity. That is not how prosecutors work. I don't know where that became a compelling form of evidence in rhetorical argument, but that's never been used to criminally prosecute people, right? There's this myth that if you can show that someone had the means, that someone had the motive, and that someone had the opportunity, that you're making a very strong case. That's not how prosecution works. It's entirely mythology. You don't get to successfully prosecute people by showing that they had the means, the motive, and the opportunity.
That he left for the presidency. Just for the full picture there.
Yeah, means, motive, opportunity. That will not get you any convictions. Prosecutors don't argue that way. It's a mythology that has erupted, and I assume it comes from TV or movie scripts. Does not reflect the real world, how the criminal justice system works.
So, I believe that even if you were to take 100 Democrats and say, okay, all you 100 Democrats, you have the motive, it's physically possible, would you do it? Most of those Democrats would say, I know I have the motive, and I know I could do it, but I'm not really the lawbreaker type. I'd rather not go to jail. You know, my family doesn't want me in jail, so I wouldn't personally do it. So if you take 100 Democrats, I think most of them, 95% or whatever, could easily come down on the side of, I'm not going to break the law. You know, that's not what I do. But you don't need 95% of them. You only need 5%. You only need 5% of the people who could do the crime to say, I'll do it, right? You don't need the other 95. You just need 5. What are the odds that...
Okay, so there's a science of how do we know what we know? And it's a branch of philosophy. And I'm blanking on the word, so someone is going to put it into the chat. What's the philosophy that deals with how do we know what we know? So this is great. This is like COVID. Like COVID hit, and then suddenly we all started having really strong opinions about the severity of COVID, whether COVID was a hoax or not, how governments should react to COVID, whether governments were overreacting, underreacting, right? We were all suddenly expressing very strong opinions about something that we didn't know very much about. So too with voter fraud. Now, for the past 4 days, thousands of us are expressing very strong opinions about voter fraud. But how many of the people who are expressing very strong opinions about voter fraud have read a book on voter fraud? So this is classic to me. This is really important. So I don't know anything about voter fraud beyond hearing it talked about on talk radio and on Fox News and in op-eds. So I decided to read a couple of books on voter fraud. And so I was more interested in the opinions of academic experts than in the opinions of columnists such as John Fund. And when I opened up John Fund's book and started reading, I fairly quickly closed it because it was crap. He was started out by making the argument that 8 of the 9/11 hijackers were eligible to vote. So I turn to academic experts, and if they don't seem overly partisan, then I take them more seriously. So that's what I do. Topic I don't know, I immediately go to academic experts. Now, that's not guaranteed to be correct. That's not guaranteed to give me the wisdom or the knowledge. Does not guarantee anything. Come on, what's the word for... what's the word? How do we know what we know? Come on, guys. But yeah, I go to academic experts, and then I may not stay with their opinions. But listening to Scott Adams here talk, I don't think he's ever read a book by an academic expert on voter fraud, because I don't think his suppositions would stand up, and I don't think he would make them if he'd simply read one book about voter fraud.
I'll just pick a number for conversation here. What are the odds that 5 out of 100 Democrats would be completely willing to do the crime? They'd have the motive, and they'd have the opportunity, and they would know exactly how to do it because they've been doing it for decades at a smaller scale. I would say the odds of a crime happening under the conditions that I just described, 100% strongest motive anybody ever had for a crime, to get rid of Hitler in their minds.
Epistemology, that is the study of how do we know what we know.
Opportunity? Of course, of course. Who would doubt that there's opportunity? Thinking they can get away with it? Don't you think they've been getting away with it for decades? Do you think Blagojevich is wrong? Because you would have to think there's something about what I just said is wrong.
See, this is really shallow thinking. Scott Adams is putting it on those who think that Blagojevich is wrong. That's not how a rational discussion works. If you are going to make a claim, it is on you to back it up. But to Scott Adams, it's on those who don't believe that the evidence is that the onus is on them to back up their lack of belief. That Blagojevich or anyone says that any political party has been stealing votes for decades is not evidence. That's just hearsay. But Scott Adams finds it so compelling that he sees the onus is on those who are skeptical of Blagojevich's claim. This is not how rational discussion works. You make a claim like that, then it is incumbent upon you to present evidence. It is not incumbent upon those who are skeptical of what you say to provide evidence that you are wrong. So this is not Scott Adams at his best here.
For you to think that there wasn't a lot of fraud. Now, was there enough? If you added it all together, would it change the result? Well, let's dig down a little bit. Let me give you some things that people are seeing. And I tweeted a few long threads where the data nerds are digging into this. If you dig into the data, it turns out that the data is suggesting, and this is just publicly available data, so or stuff that you can buy from a database, I guess, but it's stuff that just the public has access to. And if you look at it, are there any anomalies that stick out that would suggest that there was something massively wrong? And the answer is yeah. Yeah, so you can look at the threads and you'll see a bunch of examples where in some cases 200% of the registered voters voted. You'll see cases where one of the strongest cases goes like this. We know that Trump was ahead in some states and then late at night things reversed. Now the details of why it reversed, that's a separate story. But we can look at just the data and say, does that data look like it could have happened naturally? And here's the story that we're being told. The official story is that the early count was a certain kind of voter, and that when you counted all those certain kinds of voters, whether they be people who voted in person, people who vote early, people who vote late, that there's a correlation.
Yeah, and this is exactly what the news media said, that in these swing states with Republican legislatures, the Republican legislatures mandated that mail-in ballots could not be counted before Election Day. So why has vote count been so slow in these vital swing states with Republican legislatures? Because of the decisions of the Republican legislature. They mandated that these mail-in ballots could not be counted until Election Day. So therefore, the way it worked was in these swing states with these Republican legislatures, the votes that were cast that day showed up first. That's why there was so much talk about a red mirage, which may well have turned out to be the case, that Trump voted because they showed up on the day of the election to cast their vote, that their votes would get counted first. So why has it taken states so long, like Pennsylvania and possibly Michigan, these swing states with the Republican legislatures? It was the Republican legislatures that mandated that you could not count mail-in ballots until Election Day or later. So it's the Republican legislatures that are responsible for this massive wait to get results, for this seeming incompetence. This is on the Republicans. This was what they decided. This is the legislation that they passed. This is what Republicans mandated. This is not the Democrats. Okay, the Republicans hold both houses in a whole bunch of swing states, as I read to you earlier.
Between those kinds of voting and whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And so there might be a natural and anticipated reason why the vote could be biased in one direction early when you're counting a certain kind of vote, but then maybe you get votes from a different part of the state, or it's people who voted in a different way, and they skew maybe the other party. So that's the official explanation. It's just that you were counting different baskets of votes, and they skewed in different ways.
Yeah, so I think we know that Democrats were much more likely to mail in their votes. But why are we waiting so long to get results in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin? Well, both houses of the state legislature are held by the GOP in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The reason that we waited so long is because of Republican legislation, Republican decisions. The reason that Trump voters, their votes showed up first is because they voted on the day. Biden voters were more likely to mail in their ballots. That's why there was a blue wave.
And that's just the way it worked out. Maybe. But the data geeks said, well, if that were true, let's look at something else that would probably be true at the same time if that official explanation is true. And so they looked at the returns from the same wards, so that the same geographical place and the people who voted in the same way, not the same way physically, like a ballot versus in person. And if you look at people who voted with the same mechanism and from the same place, you find out that before midnight, they were pro-Trump, but after midnight, the same place with the same voting technique became strongly pro-Biden. Huh.
Yeah, so there is a lot of weirdness. So I want it all correlated. I want it all collected. I want it all put together. And I want it presented in a compelling fashion. There is a lot of weirdness with this 2020 election. Whether it's significant enough to shift the election to Biden when the rightful winner is Trump, I don't know. I would love to believe that. Put together the evidence.
Huh. Do you think that happened by accident? Is it a coincidence that the same location, the same basket of people voting the same way, suddenly turned after midnight? Anything's possible. But statistically, you can sort of dig in and say, all right, it's possible, but the odds of it happening in ward after ward after ward is basically zero. Basically zero. Now, that's just one of a whole bunch of statistical observations, which if you looked at any one of them individually, you would say, impossible. So there are things such as the nature of the totals themselves. There's a natural distribution of digits if things are natural, and the Biden votes don't conform to the natural arc, whereas every other vote, whether it was for Trump or for independents or down ballots or anybody else, every other vote followed this curve that you expect if it's natural voting, and the Biden votes violated the curve violently. So that would also be, statistically, extraordinarily strong evidence of major fraud. Could we be wrong about any of this? Of course we can. Somebody's asking me for the sources. See my recent post today, and I think that lists most of the sources. Yeah, so...
Look, there are Republican political scientists. There are Republicans who are expert in these matters. They need to put out this case. Right? Scott Adams has no expertise in vote law and vote fraud. So this is interesting. It's entertaining. But Republican political scientists and Republican lawyers need to put all this together and make the case, not just in court, but publicly.
Benford's law is what we're talking about, which has to do with the natural distribution of digits if numbers had occurred randomly versus, or naturally versus being rigged. So those are a few of the things that we have. I think you should expect more. So here's the big point. I think the odds that Democrats would try to rig things are basically 100%. Odds that they could, and they have the ability, one way or the other, the ability, 100%. The odds of them thinking they could get away with it, well, you don't need everybody to think that. Remember, you only needed a few people.
Okay, so remember, the penalty for messing with this is massive. Right? Disgrace, it's a felony, life in prison. So very substantial penalties for engaging in this kind of behavior.
To do the deed, who thought it was worth it. And of course, there's a 100% chance you could find a few people who have the ability and the motive and want to do it. So there's a 100% chance they have the motive, 100% chance they have the opportunity, and a 100% chance people would actually...
Okay, this is just cliche. This is not how criminal prosecutions work, that have a motive to fix the election. That doesn't mean that they have the opportunity. Because however incompetent Republicans are, you think that... And I'm not an expertise on poll watching, and I'm not an expertise on voter fraud, and I'm not an expert on any of these matters, but I find it impossible to believe that that Democrats with the potential to change large numbers of votes would have no reason to fear getting caught.
Actually take the chance. Now here's the next interesting part. If that happened, it would have happened at a large enough scale that the data geeks will find it for sure. For sure. And I'm going to tell you that if the people who are looking into this don't find it, I'm going to be really amazed. Like, it would be the most unexpected thing that happened to me all year, is if the people who are looking into this And these are the right people. Trust me when I tell you that the A team is looking into this data, and not just a.
Okay, so riots are supposed to carry large penalties too. Well, no, not if in certain locales. In certain locales such as Portland, locales where you've got a George Soros-funded district attorney, there is no rational reason to fear penalties for rioting. And here Scott Adams says something that I'm a little skeptical of when he says that Donald Trump has his A-team looking at this. I hope it's true. I'm not persuaded in this direction as yet. I don't know very much. I'm not persuaded in this direction as yet that the Republicans have an A-team behind their efforts to combat voter fraud in this election. If they have their A-team, who? Who's their A-team? Because I don't see Ted Olson. I don't see the Republican lawyers who led the Republicans to victory in the Florida recount. I don't see them leading the way here.
Be really amazed. Like, it would be the most unexpected thing that happened to me all year, is if the people who are looking into this, and these are the right people.
Rudy Giuliani, if Rudy Giuliani is Trump's A-team, I don't find that powerful.
Trust me when I tell you that the A-team is looking into this data, and not just a few of them, a lot of them. And the A-team, meaning the smartest people in the country, basically, for this kind of stuff, for data stuff, they're picking it apart, and they're not finding nothing. They're not finding nothing. They're finding something.
Okay, who are the smartest people in the country with regard to this? So I've played interviews with probably the smartest person in the country with regard to this, Rick Hasen. He is a professor of law and political science at the University of California, Irvine. He's published 2 books, highly regarded books on voter fraud. He's regarded as one of the top attorneys in the nation. And so who's the A-team that's looking at this for Donald Trump? So I'd like to know the names. Who's the A-team in this type of thing, either Democrat or Republican?
And here are a few other things that are wild cards. There's an article in American Thinker by Jay Valentine. Now, you need to fact check anything I say on these topics, but let me give you some of the things that are brewing. So I guess Judge Alito from the Supreme Court ruled that the votes that came in, and fact check me on this, I think it's the votes that came in after midnight have to be separated for counting. Now, separated means that they're leaving open the possibility that they will be disallowed because they came after the deadline. My understanding is that Pennsylvania law is so clear that if the Supreme Court had to rule on it, they would likely rule that the law had been violated if any of those votes are counted, because the law is so clear. Don't count any votes. Somebody's saying after 8 p.m. So do my fact check about what time it is that is the before and after.
And David says Scott Adams has a right and a duty to call out his concern for failure in voting process as much as any alternative media pundit. Absolutely, he does. He just has zero expertise. This is the problem with pundits. They have no expertise, generally speaking. Now, Scott Adams does have expertise in persuasion, and he has a lot of interesting things to say. He has no particular expertise in what he's talking about, and I don't get the feel listening to him that he's even read one book on the topic of voter fraud. I think I could tell if he'd read even one book on voter fraud, then I think he could make a better case.
So I've heard midnight, but I've also heard 8 p.m. I don't know which one is right. Then I've also heard that those separated votes were not counted. So fact check me on that, because the article assumes they were counted. Somebody on Twitter, just random person, says, no, that's wrong. Those were not counted, but I don't believe that. It seems far more likely that everything was counted, unless they have already, if Pennsylvania has not already disallowed them, they're counted, right? Because you have to count everything that's not disallowed. I don't see there's any wiggle room with that. It's either disallowed or counted. There's not like a middle ground there. So they're not disallowed, as far as I know. That was the whole point of the ruling, is to create a situation where you could later disallow them if you decide to. Apparently there are enough of them that if they were disallowed, Pennsylvania would go to Trump. And then you become so close to that 270 number that you need one other thing to go your way if you're Trump. Do you think one other state could go Trump's way? Let's say hypothetically Pennsylvania goes the way the law requires. That's all it would take. All it would take is for Pennsylvania to be settled the way Pennsylvania's own law very clearly says it should be settled, which is not counting anything that came in late. Then Trump has Pennsylvania. Are you worried yet if you're a Democrat? If Trump gets Pennsylvania, would you still feel confident that no other state could have a change in result? Well, here's another one that Jay Valentine mentions in American Thinker. And look on my Twitter feed if you want to see any of these articles. Now, again, I'm not the one who can fact check this.
Okay, so who's making this case who has expertise in the area? That's what I want. I want to see people who have expertise in the issue of voter fraud and this kind of litigation. Where are these people and where are they making this case? I'd like to see that. I enjoy Scott Adams, but I'd like to hear from someone who knows the topic.
I'll just put it out there that it has been asserted that the following is true. Nevada has a whole bunch of California residents who also have a place in Nevada. Many people in California may...
Okay, so everyone I know who has expertise in this topic dismisses the things that Scott Adams is saying. Now, experts are not always right. Virtually none of the experts thought that Trump would win in 2016. And by no means am I arguing that experts are always right, just as I would never argue that experts are always wrong. So it depends on what kind of experts, what's the situation. I'd just like to know people who are expert in this area of voter fraud and litigation, where are they making the case that Donald Trump has a strong case to still win the election?
May have gone to their second house in Nevada because California was closed down for COVID and maybe Nevada had a little more freedom. Or maybe they were just there anyway and they received a ballot. Is it possible that some tens of thousands of Californians received ballots in both California and in Nevada? And could it be possible that there were tens of thousands of Democrats who received these ballots in Nevada and said, you know, California is already taken care of. I've got a ballot for California, but that one doesn't really make any difference because we know how California is going to go. That's going to go for Biden. But I'm not so sure about Nevada. Nevada could be close. So I've got a choice. I've got two ballots here because I've got these two homes. Which one am I going to fill out? I might fill out the Nevada ballot, even though I'm a resident of California, which would be disallowed. Now, you know, whether or not that's called illegal or not, I don't think anybody would go to jail for it if you have two homes and you fill down a ballot for your other home. I doubt that's a jailable offense, and I don't think anybody would be thinking of it as too big of a risk. After all, the state sent them the ballot. If you're in Nevada and Nevada sends you a ballot and your name is on it.
Okay, if experts aren't important, the next time you break a leg, don't go see a doctor. Why not just have your friend fix it? If experts aren't important, you know, why go to a mechanic to fix your car? Okay, Dooovid, haven't talked to you for 12 hours or so. Do you have any opening thoughts today?
Yeah, I thought it was, you know, I was somewhat joking last night when I was saying that, you know, Trump owes the Jews and he should do something for Israel in his last moments in office. And I was being like Kushner, but I think there is some bit of truth to that Orthodox Jews, Zionists were factually Trump's biggest supporters, definitely in terms of dollar amounts, support level. And I don't know how Trump regroups. I saw in the Israeli papers, they say Kushner is trying to convince Trump to concede. Trump might fight. But then, you know, the certain level, like what happened to those peace deals? Was that just an election gimmick? All these nations that are about to make peace with Israel. And is Trump really such a low character that he wouldn't carry through with that, except if he won? He's like, no, I'll only make peace for Israel if I win. And so it leaves in a little bit of a hanger, like, you know, as Jews who supported Trump, you know, we got to do what's best for the Jews. And should we push and say, yeah, we want Trump as his last, you know, move in office to permanently strengthen Israel so that we could bear 4 more years of Biden just as a strategy.
Right. Now, is there really any reason to believe that Biden will be less pro-Israel than Trump?
Well, yeah, substantially less. In terms of like the general policy, is Biden going of the overall support for Israel? Definitely, they'll probably both be about equal, like in terms of increasing funding or what Trump remained, that Trump, besides like moving the embassy in the UAE deal and recognizing the Golan Heights, he really didn't do that much above and beyond Obama, but also discrediting the UN, breaking the Iran deal. So you say, like, at least if you're a hardline Zionist, there's no comparison between Biden and Trump. And what I'm talking about right now is not mainstream Jewish lobby. This isn't even AIPAC lobby. You know, saying this is the hard right, the hard Zionist right who supported Trump. You know, we're not talking about AIPAC. It wasn't AIPAC who supported Trump. It was, you know, Ron Lauder, the Republican Jewish Committee, Sheldon Adelson. I mean, really, even Netanyahu kind of wiggle out now, like calling Biden and, putting we got to put Israel first, obviously. And then long term for Trump, if Trump is going to lose, is he, really, Rodney kind of dissed the issue that what's the possibility that Trump actually ends up getting tried and arrested and even convicted, and to say if that is a reasonable possibility, certainly like using his last month as presidency to do everything for Israel would really throw a wrench in the system.
Did you vote for Trump?
No, I mean, God forbid, I don't vote. I'm libertarian. I didn't even vote libertarian, and I'm not trustworthy. Like, I think it's nonsense that we're sitting there talking about these flawed personalities. I mean, it's the price of democracy, and I try to be a good citizen in a democratic system. But no, I think it's beyond flaw trying to rally behind one person, and it's just conducive to corruption and incompetence.
Okay, I'm going to play a little bit from Marc Shapiro and get your feedback on it.
And I looked in Hilchos Shofar, and you're right. There's nothing in Hilchos Shofar, even at the end, where the Rambam usually adds Musar type stuff. It's only pure halachic stuff. But what I was referring to is not in Hilchos Shofar. It's in Hilchos Tshuva. If you look in chapter 3, halacha 4, just reading the English translation, that when you hear the shofar, it says, wake up, you sleepy ones from your sleep, and arise, inspect your deeds, repent, etc., etc. So that's where the Rambam speaks about this. Rabbi Isaac Rice from Long Island reminded me of something interesting. But before I get to that, let me tell you what he told me, which I did not know. And this, I think, relates to what David Eisen said. It could actually be the same story that David told us, just a different version. In his book, Or HaMoadim, page 454, he quotes Rav Zalman Chaim Goldberg, the great important Gadol who just passed away. If you read the Sfarim blog, you have seen the letter I published from Zalman Chaim about Rav Goren that created a bit of a stir. In fact, the rabbinic journal Hamayan asked me, could they reprint this letter, because it is really an amazing letter by Rav Zalman Chaim Goldberg about Rav Shlomo Goren. Rav Zalman Chaim Goldberg was like between the Haredi world. Actually, I take that back. He wasn't between the Haredi world and the religious Zionist world. He was in both worlds at the same time. How could he be in both worlds? I don't know, but he was. He writes as follows. That speaking about his father-in-law, he gave a whole long essay there about his father-in-law. He says, once on Rosh Hashanah, I told him that I saw in a certain book a story with a great man. He doesn't tell which book it is, but we know it's Ish Halacha, who was the Makri, and the Baal Tokeya was a Hasidic Jew, and he was crying. And the Adam Gadol rebuked him.
Dooovid, let me just stop it there and ask you, how easy is it to be part of multiple worlds? For example, you were saying something in the chat last night about you might need to go back to your feminist rabbi, but Orthodox Judaism is divided into very distinct worlds. There is the world of the Hasidim, there is the world of the Yeshiva, there's the world of the Haredim, there's the world of the modern Orthodox. How easy is it to be a part of multiple worlds in Orthodox Judaism?
Well, it's pretty easy at various levels. So you're going to say like, oh, I'm a full member. I'm considered an equal like the other people of shul. Like not necessarily. Sectarianism could increase. Orthodoxy is almost cult-like by definition of being Orthodox, that it has to be centered around stable personality. So in Orthodoxy, you basically have to be on the good side of community leaders, various rabbis, your shul rabbi. You're saying like your shul rabbi is likely to be the same shul rabbi your whole life, and the most likely in an Orthodox setting person to be the next shul rabbi is the rabbi's son. So, personal conflicts or being on the outside in Orthodoxy is very difficult because it's the same people and the people see each other very quickly. So there's relative, ease for people to know, who's on the in, who's really doing it, who's not. But at the same level, you could be part of it on the peripheral circuits. I mean, most Orthodox places, even if they're like, oh, this guy's a joke, he doesn't keep the halacha properly, are still going to let you go to their shul. In terms like, I try not to burn bridges or conflict. So, it's like a club, but if people aren't used to religious scenarios. But yeah, I assume I could pop back into the liberal synagogue and be like, you were right, Rabbi, Biden won. Please let me back. And it's almost pay, saying like you buy membership or make donations in a lot of these places. So it could be 4 more years. If it's the liberal left, you're going to see, Trump had Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. I have a selfie with Meir Soloveitchik. Jake Turks, I hooked Luke Ford on Facebook to be friends with Jake Turks. But saying those connections might not be so valuable and Biden in the White House, Hanukkah comes, or it comes time for someone to represent the Jews, they're not going to be choosing the same people. It's the spoil system. And it's likely my feminist rabbi, like she had been out of power due to Trump, like Trump, and now she might be back in power. And whether you're going to switch from like Orthodox to Reform, that's not necessarily the case, but like the level of friendship is in terms of business. Like you're going to do business with who's making the money. And if it's the spoil system and these people were making the money because these people were in power, and now you have new people in power, new people making the money, you're going to have to work for whoever's willing to pay. So I'm very careful, not to try to burn bridges or make enemies. Even when Trump won, it wasn't like, ha ha, we win, you're going to lose, because it's the bounce of power back and forth. But certainly the price of sectarianism in Judaism has increased, and it's unclear how that's going to play out. Maybe someone like Dooovid, who made a point to not veer too much to the one side or try to keep a big picture. Like I said, why do we follow the Rebbe? I was arguing with this convert. I mean, not really arguing, but about the level of acceptance that a convert could have in Judaism. And ironically, this guy just got a concealed weapons permit. So you think like you convert to Judaism, you need to carry a concealed weapon. But just the question, if you convert Orthodox, is it like all the lesser forms will accept your conversion? I was like, no way. Like Reformed Jews aren't going to accept you just because you got an Orthodox conversion, because Reformed Judaism is not about knowing Hebrew and about the halacha. It's largely about liberal values. So it's saying like, Luke Ford can't just pop into a Reformed synagogue and be like, I know Hebrew and I know how to be a Jew. And like, that's not Judaism to us. Judaism to us is to repair the world and these liberal values. And, because Jews are largely top heavy, our strategy historically from the inception of the Jewish people till today is largely trying to get the elites on our side, a top-down strategy. Although, I mean, there are some bottom-up Jewish strategies, but I think me and Luke would agree the majority are top-down. That is largely going to be the spoil system. And, if Luke has his buddies in Hollywood that were, writers or Democrats or whatever, you will see probably likely that the people who were big into Trump, it might affect their business and the spoil system will come into play. And, like if Luke works for himself and people are paying him or whatever, it's saying like, well, I'm going to go with the Biden team because they could pay the check now.
Yeah, I disagree with you there. If you do an Orthodox conversion, you are accepted as Jewish by Reform and conservative synagogues. Now, they may not like some things about you, but there's no consideration that you're not Jewish. If you want to join a Reform or conservative synagogue, it's not a problem if you have an Orthodox Jewish conversion.
I'm not so sure about that. I know that most Orthodox converts think that, and I've heard different things from rabbis, but I'm saying like certainly at the downtown synagogue, membership is based on signing up to a list of values. They're not going to say like who converted you. You have to sign your name to a list of values, and you're probably not going to be willing to do that. And so, no, you can't. Your Orthodox conversion will not get you membership into that synagogue.
Okay, let me play a little bit more here from Marc Shapiro.
And I even think Rabbi Boyer even thinks that it should be a kamatz gadol, not to mention the fact that the Tiberian in Tiberius, see, hopefully a kamatz gadol goes back to the Sephardi grammarians in Spain. In Tiberius, they didn't recognize this at all. So some want to say that the Ashkenaz pronunciation goes back to Tiberius, which I think is incorrect. In any event, all I want to conclude with this is that it's a machlokas, like much else we're going to see today.
Machlokas means
I take back what I said, and thank you, Susanna, for calling attention to Koren, which allowed me to go into it, that Koren's approach is that we are not adopting the Sephardic pronunciation, we're adopting a modern Israeli pronunciation, and Ashkenazim are just adopting some aspects of it. So Sephardim say Kal, but in Yeshayahu, if any of you want to be the Koreh for the Haftarah,
Koreh is someone who reads aloud from the Torah or the Haftarah.
And when the person corrects you, you can tell them that this has nothing to do with the word, as we all know it. For that, there's no dispute. Okay, everyone, we're picking up now in the book. We're the Big Tshuva, number 91, page 208, voting. Must you be guided by Torah principles when you vote, or not? And the Tshuva of Menashe Klein, remember, we're in the middle of it. And it worked out, Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, the night before the election, because everyone is, they're all arguing, those who argue these things, they argue from Jewish law, Jewish values, Jewish this, Jewish that, and of course it's a machlokas. So I guess maybe we have to go back to Rabbi Aryav's approach, right? If it's a machlokas, you can, if it's a derabanan, and even if minority, if it's not a super minority, goes one way, you can adopt it. I don't think most of us want to go that way, like the Sinai halacha question. However, let's see what Rabbi Menashe Klein says. He says as follows to me. You asked about voting for the government. Do you then have a responsibility from the person who is elected? So if you vote for someone who's going to do halachically improper things, and he says in the second paragraph, the fact that you participate in the elections, it appears that you are connected, and you bear some responsibility for what happens from the people that you elect, and you're showing that your connection, and you're Ezra Tov, a good citizen. And Rabbi Klein says, he first raises the question, what's going on here? Aren't we supposed to be, or makes the point, we're supposed to be separated from the non-Jews. Here, you're going to go and vote, and you say you're going to be a good citizen. And he says, we're supposed to follow what the sages tell us to be separated from them, or actually not just the sages. That we're supposed to be separated. We're going to be a mamlachas kohanim, but like kadosh, and not be part of the nations. So he says we want to be separated from them. So what is this that this idea that we're going to go vote and be part of? I mean, if you look today in Borough Park, everyone's running around with a Trump flag. They have Trump flags all over. They all got in their cars. They had the Trump rally, and very unusual, by the way, for Haredim. I never recall ever Haredim. Among Orthodox, yes. You got the yarmulkes with the things, but for Haredim, it's a new phenomenon. But he says...
Okay, Dooovid, anything you heard there you want to comment on?
Yeah, maybe a bigger framing, because you talk about the orthodoxy in general, and I would talk about COVID-19 in the election, and my theory I'm calling multiple truth hypothesis, and we talk about with Jennifer. Luke also likes to mention cognitive dissonance from his streaming and blood sports experience of people getting triggered. I would like to phrase it in a way that there's a maximum impulse control that a person has, and we know that impulse control is correlated to IQ, but it's also correlated to things like meditation or prayer. So like, you say Orthodox Jews in general have higher impulse control than people who don't control themselves. And, so from the orthodoxy, the more in line you are with the Torah, with the law, the better Jew you are. And there's always more things we could be learning about. Marc Shapiro here, and there's just long lists of questions and questions and questions about what's the best way to go about doing this. Not necessarily based on Aristotelian logic, but based on the sages and the halakha and the Torah. And that's what I'm saying. Like Orthodox conversion, it's based on that assumption that yes, there is some ultimate factor. Like, yes, the more in line you are with these texts and the sages and the halakha, the better Jew you are. And it's very interesting. And so he's asking these questions about voting and various things, but he's analyzing it from, I guess we'd say, like, in theory, a objective view of truth, where he appears to be saying it's objective. I think, you're not supposed to be part of the goyim, or you are. So what's up with this voting? Should we be voting, or should we be not? And it's a very interesting philosophical question. Versus, me and Luke generally agree that as Jews we're largely instrumental. So it's not a question of whether voting is morally right or wrong. Should we or should we not? It's more a question, so to say, what's best for the Jews. And so I kind of find like Marc Shapiro's wonderment and is almost at the Haredim, because to me it's absolutely no surprise the Haredim support Trump or even politically active. It's saying like all Jews are politically active from what my knowledge, voting is in the high 90% among all sectors of Jews, lobbying your congressman, calling your local congressman, having the local congressman come to your synagogue. That is basically universal among all Jews. Dooovid is unique as a libertarian, but even if you're a right-wing or left-wing Jew, the tactics are basically the same. It'd only be someone I wish Marc Shapiro was right in saying that Haredim tend to be libertarian, but no, they just have right-wing values and generally organize in the same way that left-wing Jews do.
Wait, he said nothing about Haredim being libertarian. What he said was it was very unusual for Haredim to go out and publicly demonstrate on behalf of an American presidential candidate.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's one of these things that I've argued with Luke in the past, where Marc Shapiro says these kind of blanket things about ultra-Orthodox Jews and then doesn't bring a source. I mean, Marc Shapiro's the scholar who knows Hebrew and the text very good, and he's always bringing these sources. But then he makes some general claim that, from my knowledge, not only is historically incorrect. From my knowledge, Orthodox Jews in Europe and going back hundreds of years were always politically involved. I mean, maybe not your average person, but rallies. I was in New York and Israel, and there were constantly rallies. I mean, Luke, maybe you never lived in an Orthodox place enough. I don't know about LA, but even in Brooklyn, certainly in Israel, like every week there was, Hafganah, a protest. And then every once in a while, there was such a big protest that all of the Orthodox schools would close and everyone would go to. And this even in New York. So I'm not sure what Marc Shapiro is like. He unfamiliar that we do that? Is he think that that's something different?
No, he said very specifically, it's very unusual for the Haredim to publicly rally for a particular presidential candidate. It wasn't Orthodox Jews getting involved in politics. He was very specific. It's unusual for the Haredim to publicly rally for a particular presidential candidate. Can you think of examples of the Haredim rallying for a particular presidential candidate?
Yeah, I mean, the black vote, like, isn't the black vote Haredim? I mean, presidentially saying so only, I mean, certainly Haredim rallying for a candidate, like, of course, like Haredim by definition, like we're the most, textbook definition of the black vote. So if he means for president, that Marc Shapiro is saying that that's extremely rare for president, but for all other lower elections, it's not rare. But like, no, as far as I know, rabbis have always been involved in politics in electing. And like I would mention Rabbi Balkanay, on Wikipedia calls him the Brooklyn Bundler. That was already for Bob Dole. Like he was rallying Orthodox Jews to rally for Bob Dole back in the 90s. I mean, I don't see what Rabbi Shapiro, any evidence that his claim is true.
So he said a Haredim rally for a particular presidential candidate. So give me an example of a public rally, not rally as in support, not rally as in fundraising, rally as in a public demonstration, like the Haredim did for Donald Trump. I can't think of any presidential candidate where there's been a public demonstration of support with Haredim going out onto the streets, driving cars, waving flags to support a particular American presidential candidate. He didn't talk about just support. He didn't talk about finances. He didn't talk about Orthodox Jews and politics. He was very specific. He said Haredim, public rally, demonstration for a particular American presidential candidate.
I don't know enough. Like, I'm not from New York, and like McCain, I don't remember. I mean, I remember people were very active, but I don't remember people being on the street in the first place. Like saying if people were on the street rallying, for McCain or Romney, would Haredim? Maybe not. And saying in that sense, yeah, Trump is an anomaly, but the anomaly is obvious that Trump, to most Jews is a miracle. And I even told you, I mentioned Rabbi Balkanay, that Trump was considered a miracle to most Orthodox Jews before he ever ran for president. When I lived in Borough Park, people used to tell legends of Donald Trump, most famously the paying off the mortgage, or people, business that, but, as far as I know, Donald Trump has always been a legend to Orthodox Jews, just from the business world or being a New Yorker or being known to have been friendly to Orthodox Jews his whole life. And then with his conversion of his daughter, it became almost miraculous that to a Haredi person, Donald Trump is not the same thing. And then also you're adding on Donald Trump pardoned Rabashkin. Donald Trump did things for Orthodox Jews that probably no person in the history of the world has done relatively. I mean, you think like, yeah, there's a reason Orthodox Jews are out there, and Orthodox Jews who are out there saying this is a miracle. We know that most people don't usually like us. The most serious people don't take us the most seriously. And here you have Donald Trump that's been a legend to us for decades, since whenever. And then he runs for president. His daughter converts. She goes to the Rebbe. He moves the embassy. Even now, like I'm talking, like I'm believing in the temple. Saying like Trump was some sort of miraculous sign to the Jews above and beyond politics. But then I mentioned the same point about conversions, and I said like, no, I would estimate that 30% of Jews in America probably think Ivanka Trump is an anti-Semite. And we say, no, Donald Trump loves the Jews. His daughter, he's got Jewish grandkids. That like, no, your average Jew does not think, oh, Ivanka Trump converted Orthodox, therefore she's a Jew. The average Jew thinks that Ivanka Trump is some sort of anti-Semite and involved in a conspiracy, and that the Orthodox Jews teaming up, it's not because they really support her being Jewish. It's because they hate us, and they're using her to wage war, like I claim to Luke and Halsey. in the beginning, saying like, obviously you hate the average American Jews, but don't team up with anti-Semites to wage war against us. And so your average American Jew looks at Ivanka Trump as an anti-Semite being used to get Orthodox Jews probably more being used. And I'm not saying that's accurate, but just saying the assessment that like, don't think like you converted to Judaism and all the Jews think that you're one of them just because it was backed by some Orthodox rabbi. And you'll see that coming up, that I don't think that many Jews are going to stand up and consider Ivanka Trump one of us.
Okay, let me play more here from Marc Shapiro.
He raises the question, what's going on here? This is going to lead to assimilation, and this goes against what we've been taught. On the other hand, he says in the second paragraph, we see that even in Europe, they would vote. And they would, and the great rabbis would encourage people to vote. And if we go against this, if we announce we're not voting, this will create ava, enmity, especially in this country, which gives freedom. It's a malchus shel chesed. It's a kingdom of mercy. That's like a common expression in the Haredi world. Even Moshe Feinstein uses it, referring to America as a malchus shel chesed. In previous classes, I pointed out that you'll never see modern Orthodox people use that phrase. I can't imagine the Rav using it because that implies that the Jews are subjects and the ruler is being kind. If you have a different conception of government, that we're all involved. This isn't a dictatorship or monarchy. This is a government of, by, and for the people. The whole concept of malchus shel chesed makes no sense. So he goes on that since it's a malchus shel chesed, therefore you have to do what you can to strengthen it. Therefore, he says you can't make any general decisions. Everything depends on the place and the time, and to choose the least worst, which a lot of people even today or tomorrow vote based upon what they think is the least worst. And he says it depends on each circumstance. He brings an example by like Yom Kippur. You feed a person you feed a person a little bit at a time. You don't. So he says sometimes you have to do even if it's not what we prefer, because he doesn't believe in voting in theory, but we have to. So it's the least worst alternative. But then he says, he says if there's a person who's going to go against the Torah, you don't vote for him. You should vote for the one who's going to be more in line with the Torah. How do you determine who's more in line with the Torah? Well, he says you need a chacham for that. It's because one person could be against the Torah in this way, for the Torah in the other way. We already started with Rav sees this all as irrelevant. And then he says, and he says, you have to look. This person is going to violate the Rabbanan. This is going to violate the Daraisa. He says,
okay, so Der Rabbanan refers to laws developed by the rabbis. Daraisa refers to laws from the written Torah. Dooovid, anything you heard you want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, if Jennifer were here, we would talk about axioms because, how you view an issue depends on what your axioms are. So me and Luke could enjoy Marc Shapiro because we could say, yeah, I could understand the worldview where me, Luke, and Marc Shapiro basically all have the same axioms, that the Torah is true, that Hashem is real, that there's some special connection with Hashem and the Jewish people, and the observance of the law. And, so it's kind of hard to keep it in track when you say, well, would anybody other than an Orthodox Jew accept those axioms? You're like, well, probably not. I couldn't imagine anybody other than an Orthodox Jew accepting those axioms. And then you enter into the realm of interfaith, like, what about secular Jews or Reform Jews that might have some of the same shared axioms, but might disagree on other axioms versus like Christianity and Islam. And, so Marc Shapiro, like, that's right my line. Like, this is what I love looking at this stuff. And I call it tedious before because, like, to your average person, it's like, well, who cares? Like, you really got to ask your rabbi whether you're allowed to vote or not. But, maybe to me or Luke, it's significant of, some deep insight into our connection to God or our quest to do the right thing in a way that your average person wouldn't respect. That, like Luke mentioned also, that a lot of people who are Orthodox doesn't seem to be a connection to them being a good person. And so, like in theory, I would believe what Marc Shapiro's doing and what me and Luke are doing should lead us to become better people. And so, you have to keep in perspective that at least my understanding, like my combined liberal right-wing Judaism, pan-Judaism, the Rebbe encompassing everybody, is that, both sides are right. Like, yes, you do have to keep the law, but at the same time, the purpose of the law is to make you a better person. And if you're keeping the law and not becoming a better person, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. Let me play a little bit more here from Professor Marc Shapiro.
This has to be given to the great Torah sages. They will be able to tell you, they'll be able to distinguish. And this is like in Europe, he says, in Europe, the great rabbis would determine what to do. Now, this clearly reflects a Haredi perspective that Das Torah, that the rabbis, the great rabbis, are the ones that make these decisions. Now, in a sense, this is all a fiction for many, because if you go to Israel, for instance, you go to completely Haredi.
So Das Torah is the notion that the rabbis will be able to deduce from Torah all sorts of teachings about how you should vote and how you should conduct your life in ways that are not directly addressed by Torah.
You'll find plenty of people who are not voting for Shas or Agudas Yisrael or Degot Torah or any of them. They're voting for Likud, and they're voting for every party. So many people don't take this entirely seriously, but this is a position that on important issues like who to vote for, this is something you need to go to the great rabbis, and particularly in Hasidic circles, even if they don't publicly declare, like this year they came out pretty publicly, but it always was apparent who the great rabbis supported, and that's why politicians go to meet with these Hasidic rabbis, because they can, if the Rabbi Meischel says who to vote for, no one's going to listen. But if the Hasidic rabbi says who to vote for, he can pull many votes. He can pull 10,000 votes if you're more, even if you're Satmar. But all the Hasidic groups have great influence. Look, it's a very illiberal position, and it's hard to imagine anyone who listening to these classes could ever adopt such a position that your vote's going to be determined by what a rabbi says. In fact, I'm very good friends with someone from Lakewood, and he actually is a big Biden supporter, which is unusual because most people in Lakewood, it's probably going to be 85% Trump. But I said to him, you know, Shmuel Kamenetsky gave his Das Torah that you have to go for Trump. So he says, is this the first time you're holding by Shmuel's Das Torah? So, of course, they can only give this Das Torah as an individual.
So this is how Orthodox Jews talk. You know, I hold by such and such a rabbi means that you conform your behavior to what that rabbi says, at least in that particular thing. Okay, Dooovid, anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think Marc Shapiro really has an incorrect analysis of what's going on, and it's not necessarily his fault. And say maybe, you know, like I worked for community liaisons, famous, Rabbi Balkany, Rabbi Gluck, the people that dealt with the politicians and addressed the community concerns, and the Rebbes. And I mean, Rebbes have influence, but it's voluntary, and it's not that the Rebbes have so much influence and say vote for this guy, and the people do it. It's that the Rebbe is, he's like the union leader of the Jews and negotiates the deal. And if the deal's good, the people will stick to it. So it's not like, oh, the Rebbe said do this and everyone did it. It's no, the rabbis negotiated a deal with Mayor de Blasio that if they backed him, he would allow Mitzitza Bal Pet. It's not that the people were, just blindly, the rabbis said vote for de Blasio and they all did it. They all knew the reason why they voted for de Blasio was because de Blasio was going to reinstitute Mitzitza Bal Pet. I mean, there's even
why don't you explain what that is? It's it's when you do the circumcision and the man performing the circumcision sucks the blood off the baby's penis.
Yeah, I mean, God forbid. However, and honestly, since I've been on YouTube and dealing with counter-Semites, that's probably the single most common thing for people to question me about. And it's a good thing to question about because, like, if you're in New York, it's a fact. 100,000 Orthodox Jews voted for de Blasio so that we could do our ritual like we've been doing it. And, there's a lot of other Jews, there's a lot of modern Orthodox Jews that don't approve of the practice. Maybe the rabbis Luke's affiliated or Marc Shapiro or something like that. He wants to frame it in the way that I'm not exactly sure, but so if I don't know Rabbi Shapiro or his mind, so I'm just giving like a bias level that on his bias level, he maybe in his own mind, he thinks that Mitzitza Bal Pet is a bad practice and that the Jews voted for de Blasio because the rabbi told them to. But Dooovid is telling you, no, it's not it's the opposite. Jews voted for de Blasio because de Blasio let us do the rituals like we wanted to without the regulation of Mitzitza Bal Pet and other things. And the rabbis are just the ones who negotiated the deal. And if the rabbis hadn't been happy with the deal we negotiated, they wouldn't have listened to the rabbi and voted the way the rabbi told them. And Hillary Clinton is like, he mentioned Shmuel Kamenetsky and mentioned to Luke, no community Jewish organizer rabbi ever tells Orthodox Jews to vote Republican. There might be a handful or organists, but actually head communal leaders, we're all Democrats because we live in liberal areas controlled by Democrats, and our communities are extremely dependent on welfare programs that are aligned with the Democratic Party. If you check in 2016, Chabad, there's different shitas. Chabad never tells people how to vote, and Chabad voted overwhelmingly Trump. But in Brooklyn, in Borough Park, in all these various places, the only rabbis who told people to vote for all said vote for Hillary Clinton. And in terms of now, The only Orthodox rabbi I have heard of that said to vote for Trump is this guy, Shmuel Kamenetsky. And if any other Orthodox rabbi said to vote for somebody, it was to vote Democrat. And however, for president, a lot of Jews disobey the rabbi. And even though the rabbi said to vote Democrat, and you can see a high percentage, maybe even 80% of Hasidic Jews disobeyed the rabbis who all said to vote for Hillary Clinton and still voted for Trump. I mean, is that not how are you reading it, Trump? Luke?
Well, I do know that most Orthodox Jews voted Trump and that he has something like 80% approval ratings among Orthodox Jews. So,
I mean, in LA, is there any communal big rabbi, not like a political rabbi, but a head of a congregation, head of an organization that isn't a Democrat that tells Orthodox Jews to vote Republican?
No, because any congregational rabbi would be in trouble if he made any public pronouncement on who you should vote for. You'd lose your tax-exempt status for your synagogue or yeshiva.
I didn't mean because of that. But I meant that, just people with influence in the community. As far as I know, almost all of them, it's because we negotiate deals. We don't negotiate deals with Republicans. We only negotiate deals with Democrats. So if you vote for a Republican, you're voting against the deal that the rabbis negotiated with the Democrats.
So I haven't been paying attention to how the rabbis told people to vote. I do know that Trump will have received 75% or more of the Orthodox vote, and maybe 10% of the secular Jewish vote.
Well, I mean, I say this because I told you many times, like the first job I did in Borough Park was getting food stamps for people, and like a vote for Republican is a vote against food stamps usually. And you might say, okay, but this, is he really going to cancel the program? And a rabbi who knows the communal concerns is going to be whatever the hell reason people are voting for Trump for. I know the need, like the rabbis who distribute the charity. So if you're talking like a Hasidic group that 25% of the people are basically completely subsisting off of charity. And that of that charity that they get, and maybe another 25% of the people are subsisting off of partial amounts of charity. And even in the modern Orthodox world, it could be like that. And that a good portion of that charity is coming from Democratic programs. And even though someone like Luke might look at it and be like, nah, like I like the Republicans, like if you had kids in school or you were reliant on those charities, you're voting against your own interest. And that's why I'm saying in blue areas, rabbis, Jewish Institute leaders are almost universally Democratic, but it doesn't mean that the actual constituency of Orthodox Jews, just the way we look at it, you're an Orthodox Jew and you're looking at TV and you're looking at what the people are saying and you're looking at Israel and this and that, and you're not thinking that the most important issue is the continuance of welfare programs, but in reality, it probably is.
Okay, so I don't know any Jews on welfare, and I'm not aware of any community that I go to in Orthodox Judaism in Los Angeles where there's a large number of people on welfare. So this is a mindset I'm completely unfamiliar with. I know it exists in some parts of Orthodox Judaism where they are experts at being schnorrers, leeching off the system. I just don't know Jews like that, and I have no acquaintance in my own life with communities like that. But let me get back.
That's even the expression there that you used is pejorative, that if you were in New York and a convert, like you would not be able to use that expression because like you would be talking against half of the people. So Luke's experience in LA, he may be doing nothing wrong and he may be speaking, but like to a level, I mean, one thing you're looking at, certain the Holocaust survivors, people that are trying to preserve the Yiddish language or whatever reason why people are on welfare, but the sentiment like schnorrers and that like that's not a sentiment in New York. So it's saying like I'm not sure.
It depends on the community in New York, and I would not be a part of any Jewish community that stigmatized the use of schnorrer. I would not be part of any Jewish community that leached off the system. So
but
I
you
would
are.
find
But I think that's the majority of us.
I'm sorry?
But you are by default. That's the majority of us.
No, most Orthodox Jews are not on welfare. Most Orthodox Jews regard taking welfare as shameful, or at least the ones that I know. the communities that I would be a part of. I would not be a part of any community that thought it was just fine for people to leech and to be schnorrers. So even in New York, there are plenty of communities that consider taking charity and taking welfare to be shameful if you can possibly work instead.
I mean, we've been having the same, forms of this argument since the first time we talked. And saying, yes, Luke could join elite, so to say, congregation, and he chooses, his neighbors, the Jews that he wants to pray with and live with. But to make a judgment on Judaism that as a Jew, it's not good to do that, that is saying is incorrect. And the majority of, your buddies in LA and in Beverly Hills might agree with you. But of the major rabbis that know the larger situation, and is saying that, you and your buddies in Beverly Hills are probably fine. But what about the 100,000 Jews that hardly speak English and have no way of earning a livelihood or various things? And that is not our value to say, to make them suffer and make them work hard. Our value is to hook them up with charity. And so I'm not claiming that, Luke is a bad Jew for wanting to have a bunch of rich buddies in Beverly Hills or doesn't like that character trait, but to say it's not Jewish or that there's something wrong about it, I would say it's incorrect. And to say, Luke represents elite minority of Jews. What I'm saying represents the majority of Jews, the Jews that most people are familiar with if they live in big cities.
Okay, let me play more here from Marc Shapiro.
Private citizen, not as a member of the Moetzes Gedolia Torah of the Aguda, because it's, I assume Aguda is a nonprofit, right? As a nonprofit, you can't endorse. But that's what he says, and he says you have to vote because if you don't, maybe someone worse.
Yeah, if you're a part of a nonprofit, you can't endorse a political candidate, or you could lose your nonprofit status.
Will come in, and he cites a proof from a Gemara that in where is it, in Sota, that in the days of the Romans, the Jews had to send a sacrifice to be offered on their festival. So they paid money that they could send it the day before. So the sacrifice was still offered, but it wasn't on the festival. And then they were able to arrange that they'd send it. It's no longer alive. It's already slaughtered. So the result, what the Gemara is showing you, is that sometimes you're in a difficult situation. You try to lessen the severity of any infraction. And that's his point here, that really we would not want to be in this situation, but under circumstances we have to vote for all sorts of reasons. Therefore, it should be for the person who's going to be more in line with Torah. And how to determine that, you have to ask the rabbis. I don't think it's as crazy as it sounds for many, because I think many people also are going to vote and they're saying, what's in line with ethical values? Isn't that Torah values? That's not so. So Rabbi Klein, he's not just thinking the way you might be thinking in terms of broader ethical things. He's looking more in technical halachic things, will you permit abortion, etc. But the idea that you have to be guided by moral, ethical values, that's no different than saying you have to be guided by Torah perspectives. And perhaps that position is closer to what Menashe Klein is saying than the position that you don't need to be concerned about these things at all. So that's his position. This Rabbi Aryeh Clapper, from outside of Boston, from Sharon, he has an institute every summer, base measures for very talented college students, where they come and now they did it by Zoom this year, but they would come for a couple of weeks and they focus on Jewish law and philosophy, how it deals with issues of the day. This year he dealt with ideas of citizenship, as reflected in rabbinic sources, and they actually studied this tshuva as one of the things. He told me they studied it as one of the approaches to how to deal with citizenship. Obviously, when you look at, say, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and the German Gedolim, how they view what it means to be a citizen, it's very different than someone who comes from Hungary, and Jews were never really welcome, never part of society in that way. But that's the tshuva. This is followed, and this is a completely separate tshuva, the next one, but this is also, to me, 1988. And I turned to Rav Menashe Klein because I found two interesting passages, and I wanted to hear his opinion on them, his perspective. In Rav Meir Don Plotsky's, the author of the Klei Chemda, a very interesting parish on Chumash. In my blog post, not the last one, I think it was the one before, I found in one of his works, he describes how when he came to New York, he gave a shiur at Yeshivas Rav Yitzchak Chaim. But Rav Meir Don Plotsky is regarded as one of the great Polish Gedolim. He, along with one or two others, but he in particular was one of the people who exposed the Yerushalmi Kudshim, the Yerushalmi on the order of Kudshim, as a forgery. He even wrote a whole book on this. So, and in rabbinic circles, he just referred to him as Rav Meir Don. Meir Don Plotsky. So he says at the end of Mishpatim, the first section, he's speaking about going to the idea of secular courts, Jewish courts. He then has in brackets, he says that none of this makes a difference according to law, because everything I said that you're not supposed to go to the courts of the land, that you have to go to Beis Din, only applies to the Shoftim, doesn't apply to the Shoftim Bizmanenu, it doesn't apply to the courts in Poland that we have, and they're not Arkos. And you have to regard them as it's Dina de Malchus Adina. But I'm referring, when I speak about not going to the courts, the secular courts, Medinos Rechokos, those faraway states, countries like China and Japan, She'ovdim Sham Aku, V'yesh Lam Din Chaz, because there they worship idols. And now this is a common thing at the beginning.
Okay, yeah, Dooovid, anything there you want to comment on? Okay, I guess not.
Books, they always say anytime I make a negative comment about the nations among who we.
Oh, yeah, I apologize. I was muted.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he's making some interesting technicalities. They're looking like at deeper issues of really what we talk about, like citizenry, and I think the Yoram Hazani doesn't analyze these things from a halachic point of view in terms of what's our obligation as Jews, in just a pure, are we allowed to do this or not? What is the way the Torah would encourage us to look at things? And I think it's related to that view. My Sephardi local rabbi used to make fun of Ashkenazic Jews and say, but it's the nature of Ashkenazic Jews. Rashi rules that you're allowed to collect charity to pay for your servant. That like you're a Jew, you're royalty. You should not be doing the task of a servant. If you do not have enough money for a servant, Rashi says you could collect money for that. You're a Jew. You're above doing that kind of stuff. And in the current American sentiment, like Doovid's going to say, like, you're a Jew, you should be management, not labor. And he's saying, you can't say that. Like, what? Because you're a Jew, you deserve to be management, not labor. Versus a classical understanding of what Judaism is. And then what if there's a dispute between the land that you live in and the direction of the religion? So when you analyze these topics of, who should I vote for? How should I conduct myself as a citizen? According to, so to say, the law, your average Jew, even Orthodox Jew, Haredi Jew, probably is more in line with the instrumental strategy. How do we conduct ourselves in a way that works out best for everybody? Hopefully not just best for ourselves, but best for society at large. And then there's the level of hope. It's like, coronavirus. My Orthodox friends are all like, we hope this is going to be over soon. And then I see, the experts now that Trump is possibly lost are pushing back that coronavirus, we're not going to have a vaccine soon. Stop believing in miracles. Vaccine's probably going to take years, get used to these masks. And so you're going to tell, it's like, the doctor says, I'm sorry, you're going to die. And you go to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, doctors are wrong, miracles happen. And then the rabbi's a jerk because he told you there's a God and miracles could happen. And then you're going to push that on Orthodox Jews. And I think it's the tendency of, what I'm pushing back on Luke. I'm saying Orthodox Jews do not like Trump because the rabbis tell them to. Orthodox Jews like Trump because we have a tendency to believe in signs and miracles. And Donald Trump has provided these signs and miracles in a way that is really unprecedented. And even said, like Luke himself, from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, Luke's conversion to Judaism is miraculous. And so you say, like, okay, like, I'm not a superstitious person. I don't think we're looking at a miracle. All we have here is Luke Ford. But you say, like, no, something miraculous happened here, and I'm a believer. But when Jews en masse act according to those beliefs in public, it could have a reaction. It could have an extremely big reaction. And we talked about the Holocaust, and possibly, was it just mindless hatred, or was it a natural reaction of conflicting group strategy? And if people are just believing in miracles, is that from an atheistic point of view, even with a rationalist like Marc Shapiro, who's trying to do the best of both worlds, are we just hoping our group strategy is going to work?
There's a question in the chat. If you're a Jew, you're royalty. Could Dooovid expand on this, and could you do it while I take a 2-minute break? So Dooovid, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying that's a textual, like, from a modern day, like, that's why I'm a Reformed Jew, because like my ancestors didn't think that view was tenable, and like to America and the Revolution and these things. But it's I'm not exactly sure if there's a word for royal, like King David and the king, to call the Jews royalty, like a priesthood nations. But the Torah is very clear. God chose the Jewish people. The Jewish people are a special nation separated from the other nation. And, to use the term royalty, it's questionable whether the Bible used that term, but the biblical scholars, certainly in Europe for the last 1,000 years, generally have favored the term royalty. Like I got my Chess Life magazine. They call chess the royal game. So I mean, just the word royal could mean different things to different people, and it kind of means that saying like, yeah, you're automatically management, like you're royalty. You're not meant for labor. So if you found someone, who was the king's son working out in the field who didn't know he was the king's son, you would assume that once it becomes known that he's the king's son, he's not going to continue working in the field. He's going to be raised to management. So like Rebbe Nachman's stories, the Kabbalistic literature, like even L'chad Dodi, our prayers. That's the language of our prayers. Like our Friday night, come greet the Sabbath queen, and God is considered the king, and the Jewish people are considered the queen. Or there's different versions of the way the texts describe it. So if, like me and Luke are in synagogue studying Torah, trying to be better Jews and reading our text, and we're just trying to encourage each other to do these things. Like God really cares that we do it. God is gonna change reality in a certain way based off of how we do it, and the way we understand is like because we're like royalty. And then from a modern American perspective, maybe you're going to come to the point, well, people don't really like the royalty that much. Like that's why people are anti-Semites, because you guys think you're special. So as a group strategy, that was one of the biggest pushes for reform, that the Reform Jews changed our religion and said, you know what, you're right. We accept the critiques that you gave to our religion, and we are willing to change it and detach from the religion those things that you critiqued. And that's what I mentioned to like Luke Ford. Like can Luke Ford become considered a Jew according to all people? But Reform Jews changed our religion, like egalitarianism. Like there's no Reform synagogue I know of that doesn't have mixed seat between men and women. There's no Orthodox synagogue I know of that doesn't have separate seating. And even like conversions, who's a Jew, and these things became somewhat legalized in Reform. So you say, oh, it's not official because Judaism is a religion, it's the word of God. It's not the voice of the community leaders of the Jews. And if the community of the leaders of the Jews decide to make a ruling that's not in line with God, the ruling is null. And that's largely the Orthodox position. But then you could have the pushback and say, well, everybody falls short. And it's interesting, the approach to Judaism is saying like, okay, Dooovid, so how does Luke, a guy like Luke, like a convert, portray himself to the larger world? Does he have to have a dual personality, that when he's in synagogue and talking with his fellow Jew, that he's like, yeah, we're like royalty and we're destined for management, but then more humble approach when dealing with the larger world? Can you do you say this it was just the sages that said this language? Humility is the key thing. So yeah, the sages, in order to encourage people, like the royalty concept is basically an extension of punishment for sin and reward for good deeds. And it's a way of saying that, yes, I expect to, and in fact, I'm required to believe that there's going to be reward for me doing these things. Like if I keep Sabbath, if I put on tefillin, if I put tzitzis, any keep kosher, that I'm required to believe that there's an external force that's going to reward me. So me and Luke could go through a period of weak belief and saying like I don't really feel God right there. I don't feel this external force that cares whether I wore tzitzis or this or that. However, I'm obedient to the community, to the culture, to the deeds, and it's the dissonance. It's very hard not to have dissonance. And then if you're going to have an us versus the world mentality, I think a lot of Jews, possibly rightfully so, and you could say Judaism in a proper theological form does have an us versus the world mentality. And then you say, okay, but you're preaching Judaism in a way that's not us versus the world. That's somewhat like a reform. And Marc Shapiro is very interesting. He's from the best. I still like to call him an apologist because Luke wants to have a more correct definition of apology. But saying like Marc Shapiro to me is the essential apologist who's trying for the best of both worlds of rationality and belief at the same time. Like, to me, Marc Shapiro's even, Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Sachs, passed away. I guess Zechariah the Bracha did a lot of things for Jews. Wasn't my outlook, but to me, I even like Marc Shapiro better than Rabbi Sachs. I think his intellectual expression of Judaism is superior, but I generally am skeptical of the best of both worlds hypothesis, and so say maybe it really is us against the world, and that is the way we're supposed to look at it.
Okay, Dooovid, I'm going to move on. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate talking a little bit of Torah. So, blessings. Good luck with your show. Thanks for having me on, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dooovid. Here's a little something from Jefferson Lee. On the
Shortly
election.
after Trump was elected, he appointed, Kobach, whoever the hell his name is,
Chris
to be the head of a voter fraud commission.
And he disbanded it.
It's since been disbanded. I don't want to fucking hear it. If you think that voter fraud was going to be an issue, maybe you shouldn't have disbanded the fucking commission that you created to investigate it. There are no situations here where we could say that Donald Trump doesn't deserve to lose this election. None. Zero. He fucked over his supporters. He did nothing to preserve the integrity of the election. Sorry, bro, you lost. Period. And let this be, by the way, if you are one of the people that are watching this that actually thinks that voter fraud is a main issue as to why Trump lost, let this be a lesson to you, which is that if you're going to run for office, make sure some of your fucking guys are in the room when the votes are counted. Make sure it's not a couple people who hate you that are counting the votes. That's something you should think about before you do it. Because by the time you realize that it's a problem, it's already too late.
So what do you attribute this then to? Naivete? Complicity? Malice?
Well, attribute what to?
The lack of action, the chest beating. I mean, Trump is not a guy who's actually really successful on his own merits. The only thing he's ever done right is media. And that was something he had a leg up on everybody because he was already a billionaire.
I don't know. I mean, that's in and of itself, I think, is a question, something that deserves being unpacked by the two of us or the three of us with Tyler at a later point. Who is Donald Trump? Who is this person? Why did he run for office? We'll never know, right? All we can do is of course, speculate from a distance. All I'll say is this. I've seen this movie before. I've seen the way the conservatives behave before. And this idea of being happy losers, gleeful losers, is kind of baked into the cake in the American presidency, the American system. And I don't know what to attribute it to. To be fair, I think if we were going to discuss that, it would take some serious preparation on both of our parts to sit down and actually kind of figure out what's causing this kind of psychological phenomenon. And that's something that I could probably learn more from you than anything else. I think that all I'll say is this. I'm comfortable making predictions about the way this is going to happen just based on the way Trump has acted over the last 4 years. Trump has been ultimately a loser over the past 4 years. He's been beaten down and happy to accept it. Trump would rather complain on Twitter than actually get in the trenches and fight. And that's because ultimately he is a reality TV star LARPing as president. This is not a statesman. This is not someone that we can actually admire as a politician. This is someone who is just someone who is part of the modern era entertainment aspect of politics. And there's nothing else that we could say. And so I think that's pretty funny.
Okay.
Are,
here's
however,
David Paxman.
Seeing some Republicans very slowly, clearly for reasons of self-preservation, starting to jump ship a little bit with the wild fraud allegations that Donald Trump is making. I have two examples for you today. These are not good people. These are still people who deserve to never vote again, but work again. No, they can. I apologize. They obviously deserve to vote again. That's not what I meant. They deserve to never work again. We're going to start with former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, backing off of Trump's voter fraud claims, which are, of course, bogus. Christie, a top ally of Donald Trump, helped is a loose term, but worked with Trump on debate prep. And yesterday, Chris Christie said, you can keep saying voter fraud. And if there's voter fraud, then we need to deal with it. But you've got to produce some evidence here. And Chris Christie starting to distance.
Chris Christie, it should not have to be said, counting absentee ballots. It's not illegal. It is not fraud. It is not corruption.
George, let's say I've been fortunate enough to be on the ballot a number of times myself. I've won, I've lost. And so as a candidate, you're even more invested in the integrity of the system. Right? So if this stuff is going on that the president's talking about, all of us want it ferreted out because it would undercut everything that we believe in our system. But as a prosecutor, that's like asking me to indict someone without showing me any evidence. If you're going to say those things from behind the podium at the White House, it's his right to do it. It's his right to pursue legal action. But show us the evidence. We heard nothing today about any evidence. I want to know what backs up what he said so that I can analyze it. And let me tell you, if he's right, I'll be outraged, and I'm sure you would be too.
And if he's wrong?
And if he's wrong, then the American people are going to be able to make the judgment about this election that the results have been fair. And this kind of thing, all it does is inflame without informing. And we cannot permit inflammation without information.
So Chris Christie was maybe the first prominent actual Trump advisor to publicly confront Trump and say, what you're saying is not, at least as of now, backed up by evidence. It's inflammatory. He said he already won when he didn't. He's saying that there's fraud when there's no evidence of it. You've got to be careful with that. We then also heard from former Pennsylvania Republican Senator Rick Santorum. Now, he is not a Trump advisor and has even been a little lukewarm on Trump over the years. He is a Republican that you could reasonably describe as pro-Trump, although he has had some hesitations. He said it was just completely wrong for Trump to undermine public confidence in the election, declare victory, all of that stuff.
Rick Santorum? No Republican elected official is going to stand behind that statement. I mean, none of them will. They will stand behind elements of that statement. They will stand behind his comment about the polling and how you could make the argument that it was suppression and dishonest. I mean, you can stand behind the lack of transparency when it came to allowing the votes to be counted. There's evidence of that. And he provided some evidence for that. There are certain things they will stand behind in that statement because they reflect the reality. But much of that statement was not factual and was at times incendiary and not something that the President of the United States should say or any elected official should say.
You said
unless you have evidence to prove it. And at this point in time, we don't, and we won't until there is an investigation as to what happened. And I got to tell you, I sat there and I listened to him talking about the votes being taken away from him, and then he shifted to Arizona and said, hey, I win this thing if they count the votes. Well, how can you say, well, we have to wait and count the votes in Arizona, and I can win this thing for making it, but if you count the votes in Philadelphia, you're stealing them. The reality is, in Pennsylvania, Democrats voted by mail and Republicans voted by in person. And it's because you asked them to do so.
Shortly after Trump.
Okay, I want to go back to the main question of vote fraud. This is Rick Hasen, a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, talking with Tom Zona, a journalist.
Constitutional system that decentralizes power and that makes it very difficult because of the amendment process to actually get meaningful election reform passed in a way that could fundamentally change how we conduct these elections.
You've called for automatic voter registration and even a national ID card. Is this feasible?
I like to say this is a proposal that unites Democrats and Republicans because they all hate it. Democrats don't like the national ID card that gets involved in all kinds of issues of immigration and things like that. And Republicans don't like the automatic voter registration aspect of things. I don't know that it's immediately feasible, but it is how just about every other advanced democracy runs their elections. Most other countries have a national ID card. I mean, if we had that, I would want to move to it in a way that put no burdens on voters to get these cards. The government would have to bear all the expenses and would have to proactively go out and make sure that people can get these cards. They'd be separate from Social Security cards for identity theft reasons. And people wouldn't even have to produce the card in order to vote. They could optionally decide to use a thumbprint or some other biometric information that the government might use as an option. But the idea is, as soon as you turn 18 or become a U.S. citizen, you should be assigned a unique voter number. You should have that with you your whole life. So when you move from New Jersey to Montana, election officials know who you are and they can keep track and make sure you're getting the right ballots as you continue to vote. I mean, it would just be a rational way to do things. I have no illusions that we're going to adopt such a system. I've actually, in a recent article, proposed a constitutional amendment that would require the creation of national nonpartisan election administration, guarantee the right to vote in the Constitution, and make sure that states and localities in state and local elections comply with a certain minimal level of competence, which turns out to be another huge problem with our elections, that we have lack of resources and lack of competence. This is kind of a wish list of what I would like to see. I'm as I said, under no illusions it's going to happen in any short time period, but I do think it's a goal to move towards, to try to depoliticize and professionalize our elections as much as possible and take it out of the realm where every 4 years, look, we have about 300 lawsuits going on between the parties over COVID-related election changes. That's not the way to run a democracy in the middle of a pandemic. It's just really too decentralized, too partisan, and not well-resourced and well-managed enough.
In the state of Georgia recently, we had the spectacle of an elected Secretary of State overseeing the integrity of his own election, in which voter suppression was a factor. Should secretaries of state or equivalent positions on the state level be appointments instead of partisan elected offices?
I believe that they should be, and I would make these offices as insulated from politics as possible. So, for example, you could have a governor nominate someone who would have to be confirmed by a supermajority vote of a state legislature. That way you ensure that both Democrats and Republicans find the person acceptable. If we moved on the national level, I would want the same thing. Imagine someone that could make it through a 3/4 vote of the United States House of Representatives. It would be somebody who would have to be above politics with a reputation for fairness. I'd like to see those people insulated from political pressures. So it's very different than the kind of system we have now. In California, we have a Secretary of State who's out there endorsing candidates for office. So, it's not just a problem with Brian Kemp. It's a problem with having a system where the Secretary of State's office is seen as a stepping stone to higher office. And it's not seen as an end in its own right. These are not people who necessarily want to be election administrators. They're people who want to be governors. And that's not who you really want to be running your elections.
I'm thinking of independent redistricting commissions, such as they have in Arizona, where there's a partisan balance, and this attempts to take gerrymandering out of the question of drawing districts on the legislative level.
Well, we have that in California, too. There's no perfect system. People have lots of grumbles about both the Arizona and the California system. What we can say is that these commission systems tend to produce not the worst maps that we've seen. The worst maps in terms of partisan imbalance are drawn by state legislatures to benefit themselves and their friends. And we also know that maps drawn by these bodies tend to not be successfully the subject of lawsuits over redrawing the lines. So there's no perfect way to draw lines. There's no perfectly neutral way to draw lines. But I do think that there are ways of trying to insulate some of these egregious self-interested questions, take them out of the hands of politicians and put them into hands of people who maybe have the public interest more at heart.
You write about the expanding franchise and the contracting franchise, and I'm thinking here particularly of Florida's recent proposition to allow felons the right to vote, but then that gets tangled up in the question of outstanding fees, which some consider a poll tax. Can you explain that issue?
So Florida voters a few years ago passed what was known as Amendment 4. It was a ballot measure allowing for felons who had completed their sentences to be reenfranchised. We're talking about a large number of people, I think somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people that could potentially be reenfranchised. Although this was passed with support of both Democrats and Republicans as well as of independents, the Republican legislature came in and passed a statute purporting to be in line with Amendment 4. But what it actually did was said that you could not be reenfranchised until you fully paid any fines and fees that you might owe, such as the fees of the court costs for running your trial. Now, one of the main problems that former felons face in Florida is that there's no central repository of information in Florida that would tell you, if you were a former felon, how much do you owe? And therefore, former felons who wanted to register to vote, who didn't believe they owed money, but maybe were not sure, they would be subject to a potential new felony if they tried to register to vote and didn't know if all their fines were paid. So this got challenged. A federal court held that this amendment was unconstitutional. Part of it had to do with calling it a poll tax. I was less convinced by the poll tax argument than the due process argument. How can you tell people you can't vote unless you pay your fines and fees when you don't have a system in place to tell people if they actually owe money? Kind of a very Kafkaesque type system.
Okay, that's going to do it for today. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.